The Child in the Shadows. I still remember the first time we heard the laughter, a child's innocent giggle echoing through our empty house at 3 a.m. We'd purchased this two-story home at a suspiciously reasonable price, and now I understand why. Some houses keep their previous residents long after they've departed this world. We bought the house with years of savings, my husband Nathan and I. It was bigger than we needed, but with our 3-year-old son Ethan growing up fast, we wanted space for him to thrive. The real estate agent mentioned something about the previous owners, unfortunately having to move on unexpectedly. But we were too excited about the bargain to ask questions. The first week was uneventful, unpacking boxes, arranging furniture, hanging family photos to make the place feel like ours. Ethan adjusted well, exploring every corner of his new territory with the boundless curiosity only toddlers possess. We were happy, content, oblivious to what shared our space. It was Ethan who noticed him first. During breakfast on our 8th day, while pushing Cheerios around his bowl, he casually mentioned, "The boy under my bed doesn't like the nightlight." Nathan and I exchanged glances, assuming this was just the beginning of an imaginary friend phase. Developmental psychology books mention this is common for only children creating companions when real ones aren't available. "Oh, really?" I asked, playing along. "What's your friend's name?" Ethan shrugged, attention already drifting elsewhere. "He didn't tell me. He only comes when it's dark." Something about his matter-of-fact delivery sent a chill through me, but I dismissed it. Children have vivid imaginations after all. Nathan squeezed my hand under the table, a silent reminder not to overreact. That night, after tucking Ethan into bed, Nathan and I watched a movie downstairs. Halfway through, we heard footsteps overhead, light but distinct. Like a child running across the hardwood floor of the upstairs hallway. "Ethan must be out of bed," Nathan sighed, pausing the movie. "I'll go check," I offered, already heading for the stairs. But when I opened Ethan's door, he was fast asleep, clutching his stuffed dinosaur exactly as we'd left him an hour before. I stood in the doorway listening. The footsteps had stopped. I checked the rest of the upstairs empty. When I returned downstairs, Nathan raised an eyebrow. "False alarm?" he asked. "He's sound asleep," I replied, settling back onto the couch. Must have been the house settling, but we both knew old houses don't settle in rhythmic footsteps. Over the next few weeks, we grew accustomed to the strange sounds, the pitter-patter of small feet, the occasional thump from Ethan's room, the sound of toys moving when no one was there. For reasons neither of us could articulate, we started referring to our invisible housemate as Michael. Giving it a name somehow made it less frightening, transforming a potential threat into something almost domestic. "Michael, please don't make too much noise tonight," I would say to an empty room when the sounds became disruptive. "We need our sleep." And sometimes from a distant corner of the house I'd hear what sounded like a soft laugh in response. Nathan and I discussed the phenomena in hushed tones after Ethan was asleep. We were rational people. I teach high school English. Nathan works in software development. We didn't believe in ghosts, and yet we couldn't explain the sounds, the objects that moved overnight, or the growing certainty that we were being watched when alone. "Should we say something to someone?" I asked one night. "Maybe the previous owners experienced this too." Nathan shook his head. "And sound like we're losing our minds. People don't exactly advertise that their house is haunted, Rachel." So we adapted. We normalized the abnormal. Until we couldn't anymore. The situation escalated when my cousin Olivia came to babysit. Nathan and I had a dinner reservation, our first date night since moving in. Olivia was in college studying psychology and had always been Ethan's favorite babysitter. As I applied mascara in our bedroom, I heard Olivia call up from downstairs. "Rachel, is someone else here?" I froze, mascara wand suspended midair. "No, just us. Why?" "I thought I saw someone upstairs when I arrived, a child looking down from the landing." My heart skipped. "Probably just Ethan," I called back, forcing lightness into my voice. "He likes to play on the stairs, though we tell him not to." When I came downstairs, Olivia was staring up at the second-floor landing with an unreadable expression. "Everything okay?" I asked. She startled slightly. "Yeah, fine, just thought I saw something." I hesitated, wondering if I should warn her about our unusual house guest. But what would I say? "Oh, by the way, we might have a ghost, but don't worry, we've named him Michael, and he's mostly harmless." Instead, I reviewed Ethan's bedtime routine, emergency contacts, and our expected return time. Nathan appeared adjusting his tie, and soon we were out the door, leaving Olivia alone with Ethan and whatever else resided in our home. Dinner was pleasant enough, though neither of us could fully relax. We'd never left Ethan alone in the house with someone unfamiliar with its quirks. As we drove home, Nathan voiced what we were both thinking. "Do you think Olivia noticed anything unusual?" "She mentioned seeing a child when she arrived," I admitted. "I told her it was probably Ethan." Nathan's grip tightened on the steering wheel. "Let's hope that's all she saw." When we arrived home, the living room lights were off except for a single lamp. Olivia sat rigid on the sofa, her face pale in the dim light. "Everything okay?" I asked, hanging up my coat. "How was Ethan?" "He went to sleep fine," she said, her voice tight. "But Rachel, there's something wrong with this house." Nathan and I exchanged glances. "What do you mean?" he asked carefully. Olivia hugged herself as though suddenly cold. "I was reading on the couch after putting Ethan down. I kept hearing footsteps upstairs, but when I checked, he was sound asleep. Then I saw someone." My throat constricted. "Who did you see?" "A child. Not Ethan, another boy. He was standing at the top of the stairs, just watching me, but his face." She shuddered. "His face was all wrong. And there was blood, Rachel. So much blood on his face." The temperature in the room seemed to drop. Nathan switched on another lamp, pushing back the shadows. "It must have been a trick of the light," he suggested. "This old house plays visual tricks sometimes, especially at night." But Olivia wasn't listening. She'd risen to her feet, staring past us toward the staircase. "He's there now?" she whispered. We turned, following her gaze, but saw nothing, just the empty staircase half illuminated by the living room light. "Olivia," I began, but she cut me off. "Don't you see him?" Her voice rose. "He's right there looking at us." She suddenly stormed toward the stairs, anger replacing fear. "Stop it!" she shouted at the empty air. "Stop hiding! Show yourself!" Nathan moved quickly, trying to intercept her. "Olivia, calm down!" But she was already halfway up the stairs, shouting at what only she could see. I followed, terrified she'd wake Ethan. When we reached the landing, Olivia froze, her outburst ending as abruptly as it had begun. For a moment the house fell completely silent, unnaturally so. No creaks, no settling noises, not even the sound of our breathing. Then a sharp crack split the air, the unmistakable sound of a slap. Olivia stumbled backward, clutching her cheek, eyes wide with shock. An angry red handprint was forming on her skin, though no one had touched her. She backed down the stairs, never taking her eyes off the empty space at the top landing. "The boy upstairs is nothing," she whispered, voice trembling. "It's what's downstairs you need to worry about." "What do you mean?" I asked. But she was already grabbing her coat and bag. "There's a woman here too," she said, hand still pressed to her reddened cheek, "and she doesn't want anyone near her son." Olivia left without another word, the door slamming behind her. She never babysat for us again, never even returned our calls. After that night, the activity increased. We'd find small child-sized handprints on the walls, red ones as though dipped in paint, though we had none in the house. Sometimes we'd wake to wet footprints on the hallway floor, small ones that could belong to a child accompanied by larger ones like those of an adult woman. Nathan installed a security system with cameras, but they revealed nothing unusual, just occasional static interference at odd hours of the night. We considered moving, but the housing market had dropped and we couldn't afford to take a loss on the property. So we adapted again. We learned to live with Michael, careful never to antagonize him or whatever else shared our home. We kept Ethan close, never leaving him alone upstairs. When the presence made itself known with sounds or moved objects, we acknowledged it calmly, then carried on. "Good morning, Michael," I'd say to the empty kitchen when cupboard doors opened on their own. "Please put things back where you found them." I researched the house's history at the local library, digging through property records and old newspapers. The breakthrough came in a small article from 15 years prior, a murder-suicide that had occurred in our home. Carmen Rodriguez, a 42-year-old woman with a history of mental illness, had killed her 8-year-old son Michael before taking her own life. According to neighbors quoted in the article, Carmen had become increasingly paranoid, claiming that her son had been replaced by something that wasn't human. She'd withdrawn from the community, keeping Michael out of school, covering the windows with aluminum foil. The final tragedy occurred during a thunderstorm when power to the neighborhood had been knocked out. The article included a school photograph of Michael, a small boy with solemn eyes and a hesitant smile. I recognized him instantly as the child Ethan had described coming out from under his bed. I showed Nathan the article that evening. "This explains a lot," I said quietly. "Michael isn't an imaginary friend. He was real." "And Carmen?" Nathan asked, though I could tell from his expression he already knew the answer. "She must be here too," I replied. "The woman Olivia mentioned. We contacted a local priest, Father Martinez, who agreed to come to the house. He was an older man with kind eyes and a matter-of-fact approach to the supernatural that I found reassuring. Spirits remain when they have unfinished business," he explained, surveying our living room, "or when their passing was so traumatic that they don't realize they've died." "Can you help them move on?" Nathan asked. Father Martinez nodded slowly. "I can try, but I must warn you, sometimes entities resist, especially those who died violently." The blessing took place on a Sunday afternoon. Father Martinez brought 2 other priests, and together they moved through each room, sprinkling holy water and reciting prayers in Latin. Ethan watched fascinated by the rituals until I sent him to play in the backyard under Nathan's supervision. When they reached Ethan's bedroom, the atmosphere changed. The temperature plummeted until we could see our breath. The crucifix Father Martinez carried began to tremble in his hand. "Michael," he said gently to the empty room, "it's time to go into the light. Your mother cannot hurt you anymore." A child's toy in the corner, a small wind-up car, suddenly sprang to life, racing across the floor. The bedroom door slammed shut, then open, then shut again. From downstairs came the sound of breaking glass. "She knows what we're doing," one of the other priests murmured. Father Martinez nodded grimly. "Carmen Rodriguez," he called out, voice firm but compassionate, "your son belongs to the light now. You must let him go." A howl of rage erupted from nowhere, and everywhere a woman's scream so filled with fury and anguish that I covered my ears. The bedroom furniture began to shake, books flew from shelves, a framed photograph of Ethan shattered against the wall. "She's trying to manifest," Father Martinez said urgently. "We need to complete the blessing now." What followed was like a scene from a movie I'd never wanted to star in. The priests formed a circle prayers, increasing in volume as the disturbances around us intensified. I felt something cold brush past me, a presence so filled with rage that tears sprang to my eyes. "Let them go, Carmen," Father Martinez commanded. "By the power of Christ, I command you to release your son and find peace." A final despairing wail echoed through the house, then abruptly silence fell. The air warmed. The oppressive feeling of being watched lifted. "Is it over?" I whispered. Father Martinez crossed himself. "I believe so. Both spirits have moved on." We thanked the priests profusely, seeing them out. As Father Martinez stepped onto the porch, he paused, turning back to me with a troubled expression. "If you experience anything else," he said quietly, "anything at all, call me immediately, day or night." The house remained quiet for a week afterward. No footsteps, no mysterious handprints, no toys moving on their own. Nathan and I began to relax, believing the nightmare was truly over. Ethan stopped talking about the boy under his bed. Then, on the 10th night after the blessing, I woke to a presence beside our bed. Opening my eyes, I saw Ethan standing there, perfectly still, staring at me with an unblinking gaze. "Ethan," I murmured, still half asleep. "What's wrong, honey, bad dream?" He didn't respond, just kept staring with eyes that suddenly seemed too old, too aware for a 3-year-old. When he finally spoke, the voice wasn't entirely his. "Mommy," he said, his usual childish lisp replaced with perfect diction. "She won't let Michael go. She says Michael has to stay forever, and now Michael needs a friend." Ice flooded my veins. I reached for Nathan, shaking him awake. "Nathan," I hissed, "something's wrong with Ethan." As Nathan stirred, I looked back at our son. Behind him, barely visible in the darkness, I could make out a tall, slender silhouette, a woman, her arms unnaturally long, reaching toward our child. "Ethan, come here," Nathan commanded, fully awake now, and sensing the wrongness of the situation. Our son didn't move. His eyes remained fixed on me, but somehow distant, as though he was looking at something far beyond the bedroom walls. "Michael is lonely," he said in that same not-quite-right voice. "Michael wants me to play with him forever." I lunged forward, grabbing Ethan and pulling him onto the bed between us. The moment he was in my arms, he began to cry normal, frightened 3-year-old sobs. "Mommy, the scary lady," he wailed, burying his face against my chest. The scary lady with the long hands. We left that night, packed what we could carry into the car, and drove to my mother's house 2 towns over. We never returned to the house except to arrange for movers to collect our essential belongings. We sold the property at a significant loss, disclosing nothing about our experiences to the new owners, a childless couple who seemed delighted with the bargain they'd found. I sometimes wonder if we should have warned them, but what would we have said? That sometimes the dead don't know they're dead, that a mother's obsessive love can transcend even the grave. A year after moving, while unpacking a box of Ethan's old drawings that had remained sealed since our hasty departure, I found a picture that froze my blood. Drawn in crayon was our family, Nathan, Ethan, and me, standing in front of our old house. But we weren't alone in the drawing. Beside Ethan stood a small boy with red streaks across his face, and behind them both loomed a tall black figure with elongated arms. On the back, written in handwriting too neat for a 3-year-old, were the words, "Michael misses you. Mother says Michael will visit soon." We moved across the country the following week. They say children are more perceptive of the supernatural, their minds not yet fully closed to the possibilities that exist beyond our understanding. They say violent deaths can leave imprints, echoes that replay themselves in the spaces where they occurred. They say a mother's love is the strongest force in the universe, but they never specify whether that force is always benevolent. If you ever find a house priced well below market value, ask yourself why. Sometimes the previous residents never truly leave. And sometimes, like Michael's mother, they're looking to expand their eternal family. I still check under Ethan's bed every night, even though he's 9 now and tells me I'm being silly. But I've seen his nightlight plugged in when I didn't put it there. I've noticed how he sometimes stares at empty corners of his room as though listening to someone I cannot hear. And sometimes when he thinks I'm not paying attention, I catch him whispering to someone he calls his old friend. The red figures. I never thought I'd find myself hiding under a bed with my infant son, paralyzed with fear, as 3 figures in bright red garments circled our isolated house, demanding we come outside. But desperation makes you do strange things, and my husband Carlos and I were definitely desperate when we fled Ciudad Juarez in the middle of the night. We'd been living a simple life, Carlos working as a mechanic at a local garage while I stayed home with our newborn son Mateo. The garage owner, Mr. Vega, ran a respectable business, or so we thought. Then came the night Carlos rushed home, face ashen, throwing clothes into a bag with shaking hands. "We have to leave now, Elena," he said, his voice unnaturally calm despite the panic in his eyes. "Something's happened at the shop." I didn't ask questions. The look on his face told me everything I needed to know. In border towns like Juarez, when trouble comes, you don't wait around for explanations. Within an hour, we were in Carlos's beat-up pickup truck, heading away from the only home we'd ever known. Mateo sleeping peacefully in my arms, oblivious to the fear consuming his parents. "Where are we going?" I finally asked as city lights faded behind us. "San Cristobal," he replied, eyes fixed on the dark highway. "It's a small town about 3 hours from here. Roberto from the shop has a cousin there who's arranged a place for us to stay until things blow over." "What exactly happened to Carlos?" I pressed, keeping my voice steady for Mateo's sake. He gripped the steering wheel tighter. "The boss was taken kidnapped. The shop manager is in jail. All the mechanics have been told to disappear for a while until they figure out who's involved and who isn't. The unspoken truth hung between us and Mexico when cartels take interest in a business innocence is rarely a protection. Better to be gone than to be questioned. We arrived in San Cristobal as dawn was breaking, a dusty collection of buildings barely qualifying as a town. The arranged place turned out to be a small adobe house on the outskirts, the last structure before the desert took over. It stood alone with the nearest neighbor, a good 200 meters away across barren terrain. The house was sparsely furnished but clean, with 2 bedrooms, a functional kitchen, and a small living area. It had belonged, Carlos explained, to a couple from the south who had left suddenly. I didn't ask why. In these parts, sudden departures were common enough. "I'll find work," Carlos promised, squeezing my hand. "Just temporary labor, nothing connected to the garage. We only need to stay out of sight for a few weeks, maybe a month, until Roberto says it's safe to return." I nodded, though a sense of foreboding had settled over me since we'd turned onto the dirt road leading to this isolated house. Something about the emptiness surrounding us, the absolute quiet broken only by the occasional distant dog bark, made me feel exposed rather than hidden. Carlos left early the next morning, walking the considerable distance into town to look for work. I spent the day organizing our meager possessions and trying to make the alien space feel somewhat like home. Mateo was fussy, perhaps sensing his mother's unease in these new surroundings. As afternoon shadows lengthened, I found myself repeatedly drawn to the windows, scanning the desolate landscape. That's when I saw it for the first time, a bright red figure standing motionless in the distance, perhaps 100 meters away, directly in the center of the dirt road that served as our only connection to town. At first I thought my tired eyes were playing tricks. The vibrant red was so out of place amidst the muted browns and tans of the desert that it seemed impossible. I blinked, expecting the mirage to disappear, but it remained a person dressed completely in red, from head to toe, standing perfectly still, facing our house. I drew back from the window, heart pounding. There was no reason for anyone to be there, especially someone dressed so conspicuously. I considered calling Carlos, but we'd agreed to use our limited phone credit only for emergencies. Besides, what would I say that I'd seen someone on a public road? I tried to focus on dinner preparation instead, but found myself returning to the window repeatedly. The figure remained for nearly an hour before finally disappearing as abruptly as it had appeared. By the time Carlos returned at dusk carrying food and some basic supplies, I'd convinced myself it was nothing to worry about, perhaps just a local with eccentric fashion choices. But I couldn't bring myself to mention it to Carlos. He was already carrying enough worry, returning with only enough pesos for a day's worth of food, and the strain of uncertainty etched across his face. He'd found a day's labor unloading trucks and promised to look for something more substantial tomorrow. That night, as Carlos slept, the deep sleep of physical exhaustion, I lay awake listening to unfamiliar sounds. The house creaked and settled. Distant dogs barked in sporadic chorus. But underneath these expected noises was something else: faint footsteps circling the house, the occasional scrape against an outside wall. I nudged Carlos once, whispering about the sounds, but he muttered something unintelligible and fell back into exhausted slumber. I didn't have the heart to wake him fully. Instead, I pulled Mateo's crib closer to our bed and finally drifted into uneasy sleep sometime before dawn. The pattern continued for several days. Carlos would leave early for whatever work he could find, returning late with meager earnings but determined optimism. I would care for Mateo, tidy our temporary home, and inevitably spot the red figure, sometimes alone, sometimes joined by a second, always at a distance, always watching our house. I began to wonder if they were lookouts of some kind. Perhaps the cartel had tracked us here? But if that were the case, why simply watch? Why the bizarre red clothing that made them so conspicuous? On the fifth day, Carlos returned earlier than usual, his expression a mixture of relief and hope. "I found steady work," he announced, embracing me. "A farm about 10 miles from here needs help with the harvest. The pay is decent, and they can pick me up and drop me off each day." I should have felt relieved. Instead, a new anxiety bloomed. I would be alone even longer each day in this isolated house with its mysterious watchers. That night, I finally told Carlos about the red figures. He frowned, clearly concerned. "Are you sure they're watching the house? They could just be passing by." "They stand there for hours, Carlos," I insisted. "Never moving, just watching. Always wearing bright red. It's not normal." He agreed to stay home the next day to see for himself, postponing his new job by a day. But when morning came, the road remained empty. No red figures appeared despite my frequent checking. By afternoon, I could see Carlos growing skeptical, though he was kind enough not to say so. "Maybe they were just travelers," he suggested gently, "or workers from one of the distant farms." I nodded, suddenly doubting myself. Had exhaustion and isolation made me paranoid? Carlos began his new job the following day, leaving before sunrise and returning after dark. I was determined to be stronger, to stop jumping at shadows and imagining threats where none existed. That resolve lasted until midday, when I looked out the window and froze. No longer keeping their distance, 3 red figures now stood at the edge of our property, perhaps 30 meters from the house. Their attire wasn't the casual red clothing I'd first imagined they wore, what appeared to be robes or ceremonial garments. Hooded and flowing, the color so vivid it seemed to vibrate against the dusty landscape. I quickly drew the curtains and moved to the back of the house, Mateo clutched to my chest. My hands shook as I checked that all doors and windows were locked. For the first time since spotting the figures, I felt genuine fear rather than just unease. Something about their closer proximity, about there being 3 of them, now triggered a primal alarm in my mind. As afternoon faded to evening, I heard a sound that turned my blood cold, a firm knock on the front door. I remained frozen in the kitchen, scarcely breathing. The knock came again, more insistent. "We know you're in there," called a voice, neither distinctly male nor female, with an odd hollow quality that didn't sound entirely human. "It's time. Bring out the baby." My arms tightened around Mateo instinctively. The voice had spoken of the baby, not your baby, as though Mateo were an object they'd come to collect. "You knew we were coming," the voice continued when I didn't respond. "Bring out the child or the girl. Either will serve." A cold realization washed over me. They weren't looking for us specifically. They were looking for the previous occupants, the couple who had left suddenly. But that realization brought little comfort, as they clearly weren't leaving without someone. I backed deeper into the house, searching desperately for a hiding place. The bedroom offered little protection, but beneath the bed was a space just large enough for Mateo and me. I crawled under, cradling my son against me, praying he wouldn't cry. Outside, I could hear them circling the house, testing windows, scraping at walls. The dogs from the distant homes were barking frantically now, their chorus a backdrop to my terror. Mateo, perhaps sensing my fear, remained miraculously quiet. Just as I thought they might break in at any moment, I heard the distant rumble of an engine approaching. The footsteps outside paused, then receded. Peering out from my hiding place, I could see headlights sweep across the window as a vehicle pulled up outside. The engine idled for several minutes. Then came the sound of our front door opening. Carlos must have arrived home. I remained hidden, unsure if the red figures had truly left, or if they had somehow gained entry when Carlos arrived. Elena! Carlos called, his voice tight with concern. Where are you? I emerged cautiously, still clutching Mateo. Carlos stood in the doorway, confusion evident on his tired face. What are you doing under the bed? He asked, then noticed my tear-streaked face. What happened? I told him everything through broken sobs, the three red figures, their demand for the baby or the girl, how they had surrounded the house until a vehicle approached. Carlos's face drained of color. A vehicle. I walked home. The farm truck couldn't come today. A chill ran through me. Then whose vehicle was outside just now? We both moved to the window. Parked on the dirt track was an old pickup truck, and beside it stood a young boy, the same one who had delivered messages from town over the past few days. But he wasn't alone. An older man sat behind the wheel, watching the house intently. That's the boy who's been bringing messages from you, I whispered. Carlos shook his head slowly. I've never sent any messages, Elena. I've never seen that boy before. We backed away from the window, the implications too terrifying to voice. The boy had been coming to the house claiming to bring messages from Carlos, gaining my trust, and now he was here with an unknown man just after the red figures had demanded a child. We need to leave, Carlos said firmly. Now, tonight. We grabbed only what we could carry, some clothes, Mateo's essentials, our identity documents. As quietly as possible, we slipped out the back door into the desert night. Rather than take the road where the truck was parked, we circled wide around the property, using the darkness as cover. The night was moonless, making our escape easier, but the terrain more treacherous. Carlos carried Mateo, while I followed close behind, both of us scanning constantly for signs of pursuit. We had decided to head for the nearest neighbor's house, hoping they would shelter us or at least let us use a phone. We had covered perhaps half the distance when Carlos suddenly pulled me down behind a large boulder. Look, he whispered, pointing back toward our house. In the dim starlight, I could make out several figures moving around the property, more than the three I had seen earlier. They appeared to be searching, some entering the house, while others examined the surrounding area with flashlights. Even at this distance, their bright red garments were visible against the night. Who are they? I breathed. I don't know, Carlos replied, his voice barely audible. But they're looking for us, and I don't think it's about the garage anymore. We continued our careful progress toward the neighbor's lights, moving from shadow to shadow, freezing whenever a flashlight beam swept near our position. It took nearly an hour to cover the remaining distance, my nerves fraying with each passing minute, expecting at any moment to hear shouts of discovery. Finally, we reached the neighbor's property, a small farmhouse with a single light burning in the window. Carlos knocked urgently but quietly on the door. After an agonizing wait, an elderly man appeared, squinting suspiciously at us. Por favor, Carlos began. We need help. The old man cut him off with a raised hand, looking past us toward the distant lights of searchers near our house. The red ones came for you, he stated flatly. It wasn't a question. Carlos and I exchanged glances. You know who they are? I asked. The man nodded grimly. They come on certain nights, for specific people. He hesitated, then added, they take children mostly. A cold weight settled in my stomach. Why didn't anyone warn us? I demanded. The old man's expression was equal parts pity and fear. No one speaks of them. Those who do tend to receive visits themselves. He glanced at Mateo in Carlos's arms. You should go now, far from here. They don't usually follow beyond the valley. He gave us directions to the main highway several miles across the desert and offered us water. When Carlos asked to use a phone, the old man shook his head regretfully. Better you disappear without a trace, he advised. Leave nothing for them to follow. We set off again, this time toward the distant highway, hoping to flag down a passing vehicle. The night grew colder as we walked, Mateo now strapped to my chest, wrapped in an extra blanket the old man had provided. Carlos led the way, occasionally consulting the crude map drawn for us. Dawn was breaking by the time we reached the highway, a two-lane strip of asphalt cutting through the desert. Traffic was sparse, but after an hour's wait, a long-haul truck stopped for us. The driver, a weathered man with kind eyes, asked few questions about our disheveled state and agreed to take us to the next major town. As we climbed into his cab, I looked back toward San Cristobal now, just a smudge on the horizon. For a moment I thought I could see 3 red dots moving along the distant highway, but when I blinked they were gone. The driver followed my gaze. "Coming from San Cristobal?" he asked, his tone casual but his eyes sharp. Carlos nodded warily. "Staying at that old house on the outskirts?" The driver continued, starting the engine. My heart skipped. "How did you know?" The driver shifted gears before answering. "That place has a history. Young couples go there thinking it's safe, isolated, then they disappear." He glanced at Mateo. "Especially couples with babies." "Who are they?" Carlos asked, his arm protectively around my shoulders. "The ones in red?" The driver was silent for several miles, seemingly debating whether to answer. Finally, he spoke, his voice low, despite our being alone in the cab. "The locals call them Los Vestidos de Rojo, the red-clothed ones. They've been in these parts since before the Spanish arrived." He paused. "They require sacrifices in exchange for protection and prosperity." "Sacrifices," I repeated numbly. "Children." The driver nodded grimly. "The town has an arrangement. They direct outsiders to that house, people who won't be missed. In return, the red ones leave the townspeople alone." Horror and anger rose within me. The whole town is complicit, even the man who gave us shelter. "Especially him," the driver replied. "He's their eyes and ears, tells them which offerings might try to escape, which way they're heading." He glanced at us apologetically. "I'm sorry to tell you this, but you were never meant to leave San Cristobal." Carlos's face hardened. "And the boy? The one with the messages?" "Their servant. He identifies potential offerings, gains their trust. The house is a trap, has been for generations." The driver shook his head. "You're lucky. Few escape once marked." We rode in silence for a while, processing this nightmarish revelation. Eventually, Carlos asked the question burning in both our minds. "How do you know all this?" The driver's knuckles whitened on the steering wheel. "My sister and her husband were directed to that house 15 years ago. They had a newborn daughter." His voice cracked slightly. "I came looking for them a week later. Found nothing but red footprints around the property." I clutched Mateo tighter, imagining that poor family's fate. "Where are you taking us?" Carlos asked cautiously. "Monterey," the driver replied. "It's far enough that they won't follow. I can connect you with people who can help you start over new identities if necessary." "Why would you help us?" I asked. He glanced at Mateo, then back at the road. "Because no one helped my sister." We reached Monterey by nightfall. True to his word, the driver connected us with people who helped us establish new identities and find work in a city far from both Juarez and San Cristobal. We never returned to either place, building a new life where no one knew our history. Mateo grew into a healthy, happy boy with no memories of that terrifying night. But sometimes when the moon is dark, he wakes screaming about red people coming to take him away, and occasionally I catch him staring at empty corners of his room as though seeing someone invisible to me. Last month, while shopping at an outdoor market, I froze in my tracks. Across the crowded plaza stood 3 figures in bright red clothing, standing perfectly still amidst the moving shoppers. They were too distant to make out faces, but I knew with bone-deep certainty that they were watching us. When I looked again, they had vanished. That night I found a small red handprint on Mateo's bedroom window on the outside of the glass, despite our living on the 4th floor of an apartment building. We're moving again tomorrow. Carlos doesn't ask questions anymore when I say it's time to go. He's seen the signs, 2 red footprints in hallways where no one has walked, the occasional glimpse of robed figures on busy streets, the way certain people's eyes linger too long on Mateo. The old driver told us they wouldn't follow beyond the valley, but I think he was wrong. Or perhaps he lied another piece in their elaborate trap. Because Los Vestidos de Rojo aren't confined to that remote desert town, Their influence spreads far wider than anyone admits. They're patient. They've been practicing their rituals since before recorded history. And once they've marked someone for sacrifice, they don't give up easily. So we keep moving, always alert, always watching for flashes of unnatural red in crowds, always checking windows and doors, examining the faces of strangers who show too much interest in our son. And if you ever find yourself directed to an isolated house in a border town, offered shelter that seems too convenient, too timely, walk away. No matter how desperate your circumstances. Because some safe havens are anything but safe, and some traditions demand a price you cannot afford to pay. They say in the old border towns that on moonless nights, if you stand at a crossroads and listen carefully, you can hear the whispered chants of Los Vestidos de Rojo, ancient words in a language older than Mexico itself. They say the earth where they perform their sacrifices grows unnaturally fertile, that towns under their protection never suffer drought or disease. They say the children they take don't die, not exactly. That sometimes on the red-robed figures you can see small faces peering out from within the folds of their garments, eyes wide and unblinking, forever watching for the next offering. I pray these are just stories. But the handprint on my son's window was very, very real. The ritual of reclaimed love. I need to confess something I've never shared with anyone except my closest friend Daniela, who now listens to these stories too. I hope you won't judge me harshly. What happened occurred during the darkest period of my life, when desperation pushed me beyond boundaries I never thought I'd cross. It started 8 months ago when I first noticed the change in my husband Alejandro, the subtle shift in how he looked at me, or rather how he stopped looking at me altogether. We'd been married 3 years, blissfully happy for most of that time until I became pregnant. I was 5 months along when I realized that the only thing keeping him with me was the baby growing inside me. He never said it outright. Alejandro wasn't cruel or confrontational, but I knew in the way a woman knows these things that the love had drained from him like water from a cracked vessel. I saw it in how he avoided my eyes over breakfast, how he worked late without calling, how his touch became perfunctory rather than passionate. You're imagining things, my mother insisted when I confided in her. It's just the pregnancy hormones making you emotional. But mothers say what they think will comfort you, not necessarily what's true. And the truth was in Alejandro's sighs when he thought I couldn't hear, in the growing distance between our bodies in bed each night, in the relief that flashed across his face when he found reasons to be away from home. I became difficult to live with, I admit that freely. Hurt crystallized into anger, and I lashed out, picking fights, making accusations, alternating between icy silence and tearful confrontations. I wanted a reaction, anything to crack his maddening patience, to force him to admit what I already knew, that he was only staying because of obligation, not love. One night, after a particularly bitter argument where I'd called him a coward for not being honest about his feelings, he finally broke. "What do you want me to say, Claudia?" His voice was quiet but sharp-edged with suppressed emotion. "That things have changed fine. They have. I'm trying my best here, but I can't pretend everything is the same." "You don't love me anymore," I said, the words I'd been dreading to speak aloud finally escaping. He didn't deny it. He just stood there, shoulders slumped, eyes on the floor. "I'll never leave you and the baby," he promised. "You don't have to worry about that." But that wasn't enough. I didn't want his duty. I wanted his desire. I wanted the man who had once looked at me like I was the center of his universe, who couldn't keep his hands off me, whose eyes lit up when I entered a room. In my despair, I turned to Daniela. We'd been friends since high school, but our paths had diverged in recent years. While I pursued a conventional life of marriage and now impending motherhood, Daniela had explored alternative spirituality. She practiced what she called the old ways, a blend of indigenous traditions and European occultism that raised eyebrows in our conservative community. I'd always maintained a polite distance from her practices, neither condemning nor participating. But now, drowning in the slow death of my marriage, I reached out with no reservations. There are ways to bring back lost love, she told me over coffee at my kitchen table, her eyes serious as she studied my tear-stained face. Not manipulation. Nothing can force true feelings. But there are rituals to reawaken what's dormant, to clear blockages in the heart. I'll try anything, I whispered, one hand resting protectively on my swollen belly. I just want him back, the way he was before. Daniela hesitated, an uncharacteristic uncertainty crossing her face. This isn't something I've done myself, she admitted. It's powerful work. We'd need to petition one of the spirits I've been working with. I should have asked more questions, should have inquired about the nature of these spirits, about potential consequences, about what exactly we'd be dabbling in. But desperation makes fools of the wisest among us, and I was far from wise in that moment. Tell me what to do, I said. The ritual required specific items, most of them innocuous herbs, stones, and personal effects. But there were darker elements too, graveyard dirt collected at midnight, an animal bone found not taken from a crossroads, and my own blood. Daniela explained each component in a matter-of-fact tone that normalized what should have felt transgressive. And then there was the location. Not Daniela's apartment where she conducted her usual readings and rituals. Not my home, which would have been most convenient. It has to be in a cemetery, she said. On a moonless night at the grave of someone who died for love. This should have been my exit point. This crossing of a literal and symbolic boundary into a sacred space of the dead should have triggered every warning instinct. But I was beyond caution, beyond reason. I just nodded, asking only practical questions about timing and transportation. The night of the ritual arrived dark, humid, and oddly still, as if the world was holding its breath. I told Alejandro I was going to a late movie with Daniela, an excuse he accepted without interest. We met at the edge of the old cemetery on the outskirts of town, a place dating back to colonial times. Daniela had already identified a suitable grave, a young woman who, according to local legend, had died of heartbreak after her lover abandoned her. The headstone was weathered to near illegibility, but fresh flowers suggested the tragic tale still resonated with someone in the community. "Are you sure about this?" Daniela asked one final time as we stood before the iron gates. "We can still walk away." I placed a hand on my 7 months pregnant belly. "I'm sure." The cemetery at night was another world. Shadows upon shadows, the white marble of newer graves gleaming like bones in the darkness, the older stones crouching like mourners frozen in eternal grief. We navigated by flashlight, careful of our footing on the uneven ground. I won't describe the ritual in detail, not because I fear someone might replicate it, God forbid, but because certain moments should remain private even in confession. What I will say is that it involved a circle of protection words in a language I didn't recognize. My blood dripped onto personal items belonging to Alejandro, and finally an invocation to what Daniela called one who walks between worlds. As the ritual progressed, the still night air began to stir around us, though no breeze touched the trees beyond our circle. The candles flickered in patterns that seemed almost deliberate, like a form of communication, and beneath Daniela's steady incantations, I began to hear something else, a whispering neither male nor female that seemed to come from the earth beneath the grave itself. I should have been terrified. Instead, I felt a strange exhilaration, a sense of power and possibility that pushed aside my usual rational caution. When Daniela indicated I should speak the final words of the ritual, my personal plea to whatever force we were addressing, I did so with conviction, my voice stronger than it had been in months. Bring back his love for me, I concluded. Make him see me again the way he once did. The candles extinguished simultaneously, plunging us into darkness broken only by our flashlights. The whispering ceased. The air stilled. For a moment disappointment crushed me. Nothing had happened. Nothing had changed. Just two women foolishly playing at magic in a graveyard. Then the scent hit us, a powerful odor of decay and earth and something metallic like old blood. It lasted only seconds before dissipating, but it was unmistakable and entirely out of place in the clean night air. "It's done," Daniela said quietly. The offering was accepted. We cleaned up all evidence of our presence and left the cemetery in silence. At my door, Daniela hugged me tightly. "Remember," she whispered, "these forces work in their own time and way. Be patient, and if anything seems unusual, call me immediately." I nodded, thanked her, and entered my silent home. Alejandro was already asleep or pretending to be. I slipped into bed beside him, suddenly exhausted beyond measure, and fell into a dreamless sleep. For several days nothing changed. Alejandro remained distant, our interactions strained and minimal. I began to feel foolish for having participated in what was clearly just superstitious nonsense, embarrassed that I'd allowed desperation to override rational thought. Then, almost imperceptibly, things began to shift. It started with small gestures, Alejandro bringing home my favorite pastries without being asked, inquiring about my day with genuine interest, placing his hand on the small of my back as we passed in the hallway. Tiny reconnections that might have been coincidence, might have been my imagination grasping at hopeful straws, but they accumulated. A week after the ritual, he suggested a date night, our first in months. 2 weeks after I woke to find him watching me sleep, a soft smile on his face. 3 weeks after he skipped an important work meeting to accompany me to a prenatal appointment. "I've been taking you for granted," he told me that evening as we sat on the couch, his hand tracing patterns on my pregnant belly. "I almost lost sight of how lucky I am, how much I love you both." Joy bloomed in my chest alongside a smaller, darker feeling I couldn't quite identify. Relief overwhelmed everything else. It had worked. Somehow, impossibly, the ritual had worked. Alejandro was returning to me, his love reawakening like a dormant garden in spring. But as the days passed and his devotion intensified, that small, dark feeling grew. Because this wasn't quite the same Alejandro. The love was back, yes, stronger than ever, but other things were different. My husband had always been social, maintaining close friendships and family connections. Now he withdrew from everyone but me, canceling plans with friends, cutting phone calls with his mother short. His previously diverse interests, soccer, photography, historical documentaries, fell away. His focus narrowed exclusively to me and our coming child. "But don't you want to watch the match?" I asked one Sunday when he turned off a championship game he'd been looking forward to. "Not really," he shrugged. "I'd rather help you organize the nursery." Most concerning were the changes in his sleeping patterns. Alejandro began waking in the middle of the night every night. Through half-closed eyes, I'd watch him sit up, rigid and motionless, staring into the darkest corner of our bedroom. Sometimes he would whisper not to me, but to that empty corner, carrying on one-sided conversations I couldn't quite hear. When I asked him about it the next morning, he claimed to have no memory of these episodes. "You must have been dreaming," he'd say with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes that seemed increasingly hollow despite the renewed warmth in them. I called Daniela, trying to keep the rising panic from my voice. "Something's wrong with Alejandro," I said when she answered. "He's different. The ritual worked, he loves me again, but something's not right." A long silence followed. When Daniela finally spoke, her voice was tight with what sounded like fear. "What exactly is different?" I told her everything, the midnight conversations with empty corners, the abandonment of friends and interests, the hyper-fixation on me. With each detail, the silence on her end grew heavier. "I need to see him," she said finally. "Both of you, today if possible." Something in her tone sent ice through my veins. "You think the ritual did this to him?" Another pause. "I think we need to be sure about what we're dealing with." Daniela came for dinner that evening. Alejandro was perfectly cordial, though I noticed he avoided direct eye contact with her. Throughout the meal, I caught her studying him with an increasingly troubled expression. After dessert, when Alejandro excused himself to make coffee, she leaned across the table toward me. "That's not your husband," she whispered urgently. "Or not just your husband." "What are you talking about?" I hissed back, though a part of me already understood. "The spirit we called in the cemetery," Daniela continued, her voice barely audible. "It didn't just reawaken his love. It's inside him now, sharing his body." The room seemed to tilt around me. "That's not possible," I insisted. "We just did a ritual to clear emotional blockages. We didn't summon anything." Daniela's face was pale. "I told you I hadn't done this specific ritual before. The text was ambiguous. I thought we were petitioning for intervention, not invitation." She glanced toward the kitchen doorway. "But the way he looks at me or doesn't look at me and the way he moves... Claudia, something else is in there with him." Alejandro returned with the coffee, and our conversation shifted to safer topics. But I couldn't stop watching him now, seeing all the subtle wrongnesses I'd been willfully ignoring. The slightly mechanical precision of his movements, the brief delays before emotional responses as if he needed to remember how to react appropriately, the moments when his gaze would fix on something invisible to us, his lips moving silently. After Daniela left promising to research solutions, Alejandro turned to me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "You told her about our ritual, didn't you?" he asked quietly. Ice flooded my veins. I had never told Alejandro about the cemetery, about what Daniela and I had done. He shouldn't know about any ritual. "What ritual?" I managed to ask, my mouth dry. A smile spread across his face, my husband's familiar face, yet somehow not his expression. "The one you performed to bring me back, to make me love you again." He stepped closer, head tilting at an unnatural angle. "Did you think I wouldn't know, that I wouldn't feel the pull, the invitation?" I backed away, one protective hand on my belly. "Alejandro, you're scaring me." "Don't be scared, querida." His voice softened, becoming more recognizably his own. "I'm still Alejandro. I'm just more now, better. I'll never leave you now. I'll love you forever." He reached for me, and I forced myself not to flinch, as his fingers, colder than they should be, brushed my cheek. Behind him, I thought I saw a shadow move independently of his body, stretching longer than it should against the wall. That night I lay awake beside him, thoughts racing. What had we done? What had I invited into our lives, into my husband? Whatever was sharing Alejandro's body seemed benign so far it wanted only to love me, to be with me. But what were its true intentions? What would it want from our child once born? Around 3 a.m., Alejandro sat up in his now familiar ritual. But instead of staring into the corner, he turned to look directly at me. His eyes reflected the dim light from the window like an animal's. "You're afraid of me now," he said, his voice carrying that strange dual quality, Alejandro's familiar tones layered over something older, deeper. "You wanted love returned, and now you have it, but you're afraid." "What are you?" I whispered. He smiled sadly. "I am what answers when love is requested. I am devotion without end. I have worn many names across many centuries." He reached out, fingers hovering just above my pregnant belly. "The child will be mine too. We will be a family forever." I jerked away, maternal instinct overriding fear. "No, you can't have my baby." Something flickered across his face, anger perhaps quickly suppressed. "The invitation was given freely. The blood offering accepted. You cannot rescind what has been granted." Before I could respond, his expression changed, softening into confusion. Alejandro, my Alejandro, looked around bewildered. Was I sleepwalking? He asked, his voice entirely his own again. "Why are we awake?" The next day I returned to Daniela's apartment, frantic and sleepless. She'd spent the night researching, consulting grimoires, and calling contacts in her esoteric community. "It's worse than I thought," she admitted, dark circles under her eyes, matching my own. "What we invited, what accepted your offering, is an ancient entity that feeds on devotion. It doesn't just influence emotions, it possesses the beloved, completely, gradually replacing their original consciousness." "How do we get rid of it?" I demanded. She hesitated. "There's a counter-ritual, but—" her voice trailed off. "But what?" The entity won't leave willingly. It will fight. And Alejandro, the real Alejandro, may already be too diminished to fully return. She met my eyes directly. The counter-ritual could harm him, Claudia. Possibly even kill him. I sank into a chair, hands protectively covering my belly. So I either live with this thing wearing my husband like a costume, or I risk killing him trying to free him. There might be a third option. Daniela leaned forward. A transference. My blood ran cold. What does that mean? The entity needs a host. If someone were to voluntarily accept it, drawing it out of Alejandro. You mean let it possess someone else? I stared at her in horror. Who would ever agree to that? Daniela's expression was resolute. Someone who feels responsible for what happened. Realization dawned. No, absolutely not. I won't let you sacrifice yourself for my mistake. It was my ritual, she countered. My misinterpretation that caused this. Besides, she added with a grim attempt at humor, I've always wanted to experience the spirit world more directly. No amount of arguing could dissuade her. Daniela was determined, and in truth, I was desperate. We agreed to perform the transference that night while Alejandro slept in our home, where the entity had established its connection. I returned to find Alejandro in an unusually energetic mood, cleaning the house and making elaborate plans for the nursery. Several times I caught him watching me with an intensity that made my skin crawl, not with love, but with possession. Whatever shared his body was becoming more dominant, pushing more of my husband aside. When Alejandro finally fell asleep that night, I texted Daniela. She arrived 20 minutes later with a bag of supplies, herbs, crystals, small bottles of liquids I didn't recognize, and an ancient-looking book bound in weathered leather. We'll need to work quickly, she whispered as I let her in. Once it realizes what we're doing, it will fight back. We set up in the living room, preparing a circle similar to our cemetery ritual, but with important differences. This time Daniela stood at the center, surrounded by symbols drawn in chalk and small bowls of aromatic herbs burning slowly. When I begin the invocation, go to your bedroom and wake Alejandro, she instructed. Bring him here, I'll do the rest. The ritual began with Daniela chanting in that same unknown language, her voice growing louder and more commanding with each phrase. When she nodded to me, I hurried to our bedroom. Alejandro was already awake, sitting upright in bed, head tilted as if listening to something. When he saw me, his expression contorted with rage, a look I'd never seen on my husband's face. "What have you done?" he growled, his voice entirely, the other now deep and resonant with power. "What treachery is this?" "Please," I begged instinctively, backing toward the door. "Please just come with me." He rose from the bed with unnatural grace, movements too fluid, too precise. "You would banish me after calling me to you, after accepting what I've given you?" "I want my husband back," I said, finding courage in desperation. "The real Alejandro." He laughed, a terrible sound like stones grinding together. "There is no real Alejandro anymore. We are one now, and we will not be separated." From the living room, Daniela's chanting grew more insistent. The entity in Alejandro's body flinched at the sound, head snapping toward the door. "You brought a witch into our home," it hissed, advancing toward me, a vessel offering herself in exchange. I backed into the hallway, one hand protectively on my belly. "Please, if you truly love me, you'll let him go." Something flickered in his eyes, perhaps a remnant of my real husband fighting through. It gave me the moment I needed to turn and run for the living room, the entity close behind. When we entered, Daniela's chanting reached a crescendo. She stood in her circle of power arms, outstretched voice commanding. The entity in Alejandro's body froze at the threshold, rage contorting his features. "You cannot command me, witch," it snarled. "I am ancient. I am bound by blood offering and freely given invitation. And I offer a new invitation." Daniela replied, her voice steady despite the fear I could see in her eyes. "A willing vessel stronger than the one you currently inhabit. Come to me instead." For a moment the room seemed to darken, shadows elongating despite the bright lights we'd turned on. The air grew thick and cold, carrying that same cemetery scent from our original ritual. Then Alejandro's body convulsed back, arching impossibly. His mouth opened in a silent scream as what looked like black smoke poured from his eyes, nose and mouth swirling in the air between him and Daniela. "Close your eyes," Daniela shouted to me. "Whatever happens, don't look directly at it." I obeyed, squeezing my eyes shut, but not before I glimpsed the formless darkness coalescing into something with too many limbs, too many eyes, something never meant to be seen by human sight. The sounds that followed will haunt me forever. Daniela's chanting giving way to gasping, then to a single, piercing scream cut abruptly short. Alejandro's voice, his true voice, crying out in confusion and pain, the crash of furniture overturning glass breaking, and beneath it all a sound like massive wings beating against confined space. Then silence. When I dared open my eyes, Alejandro lay unconscious on the floor, breathing but unmoving, and Daniela stood perfectly still in her circle head, tilted to that same unnatural angle I'd seen in Alejandro. When she turned to face me, her eyes were black from corner to corner. "It is done," she said, her voice layered with that other ancient tone. "Your husband is free." I ran to Alejandro, cradling his head. He stirred, blinking up at me with confusion. "Claudia, what happened? Why are we in the living room?" Before I could answer, Daniela, or what now wore Daniela, stepped forward, careful to maintain a respectful distance. "Your wife loves you very deeply," it said through Daniela's lips. "Enough to reach beyond the veil for you. Remember that." Alejandro looked bewildered, but I could already see the difference in him, his eyes clear and present, fully himself again. Meanwhile, Daniela's body moved with that same mechanical precision, her expression slightly delayed, slightly wrong. "What happens now?" I asked the entity. Daniela's body shrugged with elegant indifference. "I will leave this place. This vessel has agreed to carry me for one lunar cycle, after which I will depart, seeking another invitation elsewhere." A smile that wasn't Daniela's crossed her face. There is never a shortage of desperate lovers in this world. True to its word, Daniela, or what was now inside her, left our home that night. In the weeks that followed, Alejandro recovered slowly, with no memory of his possession, but plagued by nightmares he couldn't quite recall. Our relationship healed gradually, returning to something like its former warmth, though shadows of our ordeal lingered in small ways. Our son was born healthy and perfect a month later. I scrutinized him anxiously for any sign that the entity had affected him during my pregnancy, but he was beautifully, wonderfully normal. As promised, after one lunar cycle, 28 days, Daniela returned to herself. She appeared at our door one morning, thinner and haunted-looking but alive herself, free of her supernatural passenger. She remembered everything that had happened during her possession, and spoke of it only reluctantly, describing it as seeing through a window you can't open, screaming behind soundproof glass. She has never practiced her rituals again. Some experiences change you fundamentally, redraw the boundaries of what you're willing to risk. I've told this story not to frighten, but to warn. Love is precious, yes, worth fighting for, worth working to preserve. But there are boundaries that should never be crossed, and its pursuit forces that should never be invited into our lives, no matter how desperate we become. The price of supernatural intervention is always higher than it first appears, the consequences far beyond our mortal understanding. Alejandro and I are healing our family intact. But sometimes at night I still catch him sitting up in bed, staring into dark corners. And sometimes, not often, but sometimes, when I look at Daniela, I see something ancient and patient looking back at me through her eyes just for a moment before she blinks it away. They say certain rituals leave doors ajar that can never be fully closed. That once you've invited something across the threshold between worlds, part of it always remains waiting for another moment of weakness, another desperate invitation. I pray they're wrong, but I keep salt at all my doorways just in case. The indigenous peoples of Mexico have long recognized entities they call espíritus hambrientos, or hungry spirits. ancient forces that feed on human emotion. The most dangerous of these are said to be those that consume love and devotion, attaching themselves to a person and gradually replacing their essence with their own. Such possessions are particularly insidious because the victims often appear improved at first, more attentive, more passionate, more devoted. Only those closest to them notice the subtle wrongness, the gradual replacement of authentic human connection with something darker and more absolute. Modern occultists call them parasitic attachments and warn that they can be transferred but rarely banished completely. Like a virus seeking new hosts, they move from person to person throughout history, leaving psychological scars even after they've departed. If someone you love changes too suddenly, too completely, even if the change seems positive, watch carefully. True human transformation is gradual, inconsistent, a process of steps forward and back. Perfection of devotion is not a human trait. It is something altogether other wearing human skin, like an ill-fitting costume. And if you find yourself tempted to seek supernatural aid for matters of the heart, remember this genuine love cannot be conjured, coerced, or commanded. It must be given freely to be real. Anything else is just a dangerous illusion, a shadow play performed by entities with motives we cannot begin to comprehend. The Midnight Taxi Ride. I've been driving taxis in Mexico City for 15 years. In this job, you see it all: the good, the bad, the inexplicable. I've witnessed robberies, breakups, marriage proposals, women giving birth in my back seat. I've driven the rich, the poor, the famous, the criminal. But one fare stands out among all others, a ride I took 3 years ago that still makes my blood run cold when I think about it. My name is Eduardo. I own a relatively new Toyota Camry that I converted into a taxi after saving for years. It's comfortable enough that on slow nights, the gentle hum of the engine and the softness of the driver's seat can lull me toward dangerous drowsiness. That's why I always keep the windows cracked and the radio playing on overnight shifts. It was during one of these late shifts around 2 a.m. at Terminal 2 of Mexico City International Airport when they entered my life. I had been waiting in the designated taxi area, fighting sleep, despite 3 cups of coffee, when the dispatcher directed me to pick up passengers at international arrivals. They were an unremarkable couple at first glance, a well-dressed man in his 50s wearing an expensive-looking gray suit and a woman of similar age in an elegant black dress. Both carried small leather suitcases that looked costly but understated. They had the confident bearing of successful business people, though something about their posture seemed slightly too perfect, too controlled. "North Bus Terminal, please," the man instructed as they settled into the back seat. His Spanish was flawless but carried a subtle accent I couldn't quite place, not American or European, something more unusual. I nodded, punched the destination into my GPS, and pulled away from the terminal. In my rear-view mirror, I noticed them checking their watches with apparent concern. "Our international flight was delayed," the woman explained, catching my glance. "We're running behind schedule for an important meeting." At this hour, I couldn't help asking. Business meetings at 3 a.m. seemed unusual even by Mexico City standards. The man smiled thinly. "Our associates keep unconventional hours." As we drove, they spoke quietly to each other in what I first assumed was English, but listening more carefully, I realized I couldn't identify the language. It had a rhythmic, almost musical quality with consonants that seemed to flow into one another. Occasionally, I'd catch them both looking out the windows with an intensity that seemed odd for tourists or business travelers, their eyes scanning the streets, buildings, and especially the night sky with careful attention. When we approached the North Bus Terminal, the man leaned forward. "How much would you charge to take us to Ixmiquilpan?" The request surprised me. Ixmiquilpan is a town in Hidalgo State about 2 hours from Mexico City, far beyond my usual service area, especially at this hour. I hesitated, calculating quickly. "It depends on exactly where in Ixmiquilpan," I replied cautiously. "If it's just to the central area where the hot springs are, I could do it for a reasonable price. but if you need to go farther into the rural areas, it would be more expensive. I'm not familiar with those roads, and night driving in unfamiliar territory can be risky." "Money is not a concern," the man replied immediately, his voice smooth and assured. "Name your price and add 500 pesos as gratuity." I quoted a figure that was generous to me, high enough that I could justify the long drive back alone, but not so exorbitant that they'd likely refuse. To my surprise, the man agreed without negotiation. I adjusted my route and headed toward the highway that would take us north out of the city. As we left the metropolitan area behind, the roads grew darker and the traffic thinned to occasional trucks and long-distance buses. My passengers continued their strange, murmured conversation, punctuated by frequent glances at their watches. The woman kept checking something on her phone, not typing, just staring at the screen with unusual concentration. "You're in quite a hurry," I observed, attempting friendly conversation to keep myself alert for the long drive. "Is this business or pleasure in Ixmiquilpan?" "Business," the man answered curtly. "A meeting we cannot be late for." "The hot springs are wonderful there if you have time to enjoy them afterward," I suggested. Neither responded, and I took the hint that conversation wasn't welcome. I focused on driving, occasionally catching glimpses of them in the rear-view mirror. Their stillness was unnerving. They barely shifted position during the entire drive, sitting perfectly upright, hands folded in their laps when not checking the time. We reached Ixmiquilpan around 4 a.m. The town was silent and dark. Most buildings shuttered for the night except for a few 24-hour convenience stores. I expected them to direct me to a hotel, but instead the man instructed me to continue through the town. "Take the eastern road toward the mountains," he said. I followed his directions with growing unease. The eastern road led away from the town center into increasingly rural terrain. Streetlights became scarce, then non-existent. The road narrowed and began to climb, winding up into the foothills of the Sierra Madre Oriental. My headlights provided the only illumination, catching the occasional startled eyes of nocturnal wildlife. "Much farther?" I asked, unable to keep the concern from my voice. My gas gauge was dipping lower than I would have liked for such remote territory. "Just ahead," the woman spoke for the first time in over an hour. "Look for a stone entrance with carved pillars." After another 10 minutes of climbing the increasingly rough road, my headlights illuminated what they'd described: 2 massive stone pillars flanking a private drive. They were ancient-looking things, weathered and covered partially with vines, but still bearing intricate carvings that my lights caught only in fragments: spirals, astronomical symbols, and what looked like stylized human figures. The private drive led another kilometer up the mountain before opening into a clearing where a large house stood, or perhaps mansion would be more accurate. It was a sprawling structure built in a style I couldn't identify, neither colonial Spanish nor indigenous, but somehow incorporating elements of both. Lights shone from most windows, and the parking area already held at least a dozen high-end vehicles: BMWs, Mercedes, even a few Porsches. I pulled up to the entrance, surprised to find such an apparently significant gathering happening at this hour in such a remote location. My passengers paid me the agreed amount plus the promised tip, all in crisp bills that looked fresh from a bank. As I retrieved their luggage from the trunk, I became aware of something unusual: a sound coming from within the house. At first, I thought it was music, but listening more carefully, I realized it was chanting, rhythmic and harmonized in what seemed to be the same strange language my passengers had been speaking. It rose and fell in patterns that felt somehow mathematical, precise, in a way that made the hair on my arms stand up. "What kind of meeting is this?" I asked, curiosity overcoming professional discretion. The man smiled, a tight, practiced expression that didn't reach his eyes. "A gathering of like-minded individuals," he said. "Researchers, you might say." They took their bags and walked toward the entrance without another word or backward glance. The massive wooden doors opened before they reached them, though I couldn't see who had opened them from my position. They disappeared inside the doors, closing heavily behind them. I stood for a moment in the driveway, suddenly aware of how isolated I was. The mansion loomed against the pre-dawn sky, its windows glowing with warm light that somehow failed to seem welcoming. The chanting continued now, muffled by the walls, but still audible in the mountain stillness. My fuel gauge warning light had come on during the final ascent. I needed to find a gas station soon or risk being stranded. I turned my taxi around and began the careful descent down the mountain road, driving slower than necessary, partly due to the treacherous curves and partly due to a growing sense of unease that made me reluctant to go too fast despite my fuel situation. I reached a gas station on the outskirts of Ixmiquilpan just as the needle touched empty. As the attendant filled my tank, he studied my taxi with unusual interest. "Coming from up in the mountains?" he asked, nodding toward the road I'd descended. "Yes," I answered cautiously. "Just dropped off some passengers." The attendant's expression changed subtly. "At the big house? The one with the stone pillars?" I nodded, surprised he knew of it. "The witches are starting early this time," he said, his tone conversational but his eyes watchful. "Witches," I repeated, uncertain if he was joking. He gestured vaguely toward the mountains. "That's what local people call them, the ones who gather up there. They come from all over the world, always at night, always when certain stars are aligned." He tapped his temple. "They think they're subtle, but people notice patterns." I laughed nervously. "My passengers seemed like normal business people?" The attendant shrugged. "They always do. Expensive clothes, nice manners. But watch." He checked his watch. "It's almost time. If you wait about 20 minutes, you'll see something interesting." Curiosity got the better of me. I paid for my gas and pulled into a parking space beside the station. The attendant seemed pleased by my decision, nodding as though I'd passed some test. He finished serving another customer, then came to stand beside my taxi, leaning against the wall of the station. "What exactly am I waiting for?" I asked after several minutes of silence. "You'll know it when you see it," he replied cryptically. "Just keep watching the mountain." Another 15 minutes past dawn, beginning to lighten the eastern horizon. I was about to give up and leave when the attendant grabbed my arm. "There," he whispered urgently. "Look!" I followed his pointing finger toward the mountain. At first I saw nothing unusual, just the silhouette of peaks against the lightening sky. Then I noticed them pinpoints of orange light moving in ways no aircraft or drone could move. They emerged from somewhere near the summit, descending in spiraling patterns down the mountainside, their movements smooth but impossibly agile. "What are those?" I breathed, rolling down my window for a clearer view. "Fire orbs," the attendant said, voice hushed with a mixture of fear and reverence. "They appear after every gathering. Some say they're spirits. Others say they're something the witches summon from the stars." I watched transfixed as the orbs, at least a dozen of them, continued their dance down the mountainside. They moved with apparent intelligence, sometimes splitting apart, sometimes merging together, creating complex geometric patterns in the air. As they descended further, I could better gauge their size, each perhaps a meter in diameter, glowing orange-red like embers but with a solid-seeming core. "This is impossible," I whispered, fumbling for my phone to record what I was seeing. "Don't bother," the attendant said, noticing my movement. "They never show up in recordings. Hundreds have tried." Sure enough, when I pointed my phone toward the phenomenon, the screen showed only darkness and the faint outline of the mountain. The orbs were invisible to the camera. The display continued for perhaps 5 minutes, the orbs descending until they reached the approximate location of the mansion where I'd left my passengers. There they hovered briefly before winking out one by one, like candles being extinguished. I sat in stunned silence, trying to process what I'd witnessed. "What happens now?" I asked finally. The attendant straightened up, stretching his back. "Now the town pretends it saw nothing as usual. The visitors will leave in their expensive cars tomorrow evening. Life goes back to normal until the next alignment." And no one reports this investigates. He laughed, a short, humorless sound. Who would believe it? Besides, they bring money to the area. The hotels, restaurants, shops all benefit from these gatherings, and those who ask too many questions. He trailed off meaningfully. What? They tend to see the fire orbs up close, only once. I shivered despite the warm night air. Who are these people, really? The attendant studied me for a long moment before responding. There are old stories in this region. Before the Spanish, before even the Aztecs, there were those who understood the stars in ways we've forgotten, who knew how to open doors between worlds. He shrugged again, his momentary seriousness dissolving. Or maybe they're just rich eccentrics with impressive light shows. Either way, best to leave them to their business. I thanked him for the gas and the unexpected show, eager now to return to the familiar chaos of Mexico City. As I turned my taxi toward the highway, a large black SUV appeared from the direction of the mountain road, moving slowly through town. It passed my taxi, and through the tinted windows I caught a glimpse of the driver, a man wearing what appeared to be a dark red shirt or jacket, his face expressionless as he stared straight ahead. I drove faster than was prudent on the winding highway back to the city, checking my mirrors frequently as if expecting pursuit. None came, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched all the way back to the metropolitan area. In the days that followed, I tried to rationalize what I'd seen. Perhaps the fire orbs were some natural phenomenon, ball lightning or methane from the mountain. Perhaps the chanting was just some corporate team-building exercise or exclusive retreat. Perhaps my imagination, fueled by fatigue and the attendant's suggestive comments, had embellished ordinary events into something supernatural. But I couldn't explain away the unnatural stillness of my passengers, their strange language, or the precision of their movements. I couldn't dismiss the ancient symbols on those stone pillars or the way those orbs had moved with apparent purpose and intelligence. A week later, curiosity still gnawing at me, I did some research online about Ixmiquilpan and its surroundings. Most results focused on its famous hot springs and colonial architecture, but buried in a local history forum, I found mentions of a place locals called La Casa de las Estrellas, the House of Stars. According to the post, it had been built in the 1920s by a mysterious European astronomer who had studied indigenous astronomical traditions. Since his death in the 1950s, ownership had passed through a series of private foundations with international connections. One commenter claimed that strange lights had been reported in the area for generations, long before the house was built. Another suggested that the site had been sacred to pre-Columbian peoples, who had considered it a place where the boundary between worlds was thinnest. I tried to dismiss it all as local superstition and folklore, the kind that accumulates around any unusual landmark. But then I noticed the dates mentioned in several posts. The gatherings reportedly occurred according to a specific astronomical schedule. The next one was predicted for almost exactly 1 month from my fateful trip. Against my better judgment, I drove back to Ixmiquilpan on the specified date. I told myself I was just confirming the mundane explanation I was sure existed. I parked at a roadside mirador several kilometers from the mansion, but with a clear view of the mountain, and I waited. Just after midnight, a procession of headlights wound up the mountain road, at least 20 vehicles moving in disciplined formation. By 4 a.m., the same time as during my previous visit, the fire orbs appeared again, performing their impossible aerial dance down the mountainside before disappearing near the mansion. I've returned 3 more times since then, on dates calculated from the pattern I've pieced together. Each time the same sequence unfolds, vehicles arriving, and before dawn the fire orbs descending. I've tried different vantage points, used different cameras and recording equipment. Nothing captures the phenomenon. During my last observation 2 months ago, something changed. I had parked farther away than usual, using binoculars to watch the mountain. As the orbs began their descent, one separated from the group, moving in a direct line toward my position. I started my engine ready to flee, but the orb stopped about 100 meters away, hovering at eye level. Through my binoculars, I could see it more clearly than ever before. Not simply a ball of fire, as I'd thought, but something more complex. Within the orange-red glow was a shifting geometric structure reminiscent of the carvings on those stone pillars. And at its center, something darker, denser, that seemed to absorb light rather than emit it. The orb remained stationary for perhaps 30 seconds, directly aligned with my binoculars. Then it flared brightly, momentarily blinding me, and when my vision cleared, it had vanished. I haven't returned to Ixmiquilpan since that encounter. But lately I've been dreaming of those fire orbs dreams, where they speak to me in that same musical language my passengers used, where they show me patterns in the stars that seem meaningful while I'm asleep, but dissolve upon waking. Sometimes in these dreams I'm no longer observing from a distance, but participating in whatever ceremony takes place in that mansion on the mountain. Most disturbing of all, I've started noticing patterns I never saw before in traffic lights and the movement of crowds and the arrangement of buildings against the night sky. Mathematically precise configurations that seem to point toward something just beyond my understanding. Last week I was startled to receive a request for a pickup at the airport, the same terminal, the same time of night as that fateful fare. When I arrived, they were waiting, the same couple, unchanged after 3 years, wearing different but similarly elegant clothing. They didn't appear to recognize me as they entered my taxi. "North Bus Terminal," the man said, exactly as before. I drove in silence, heart-pounding. In the rearview mirror, I noticed them watching me with subtle but growing interest, as if slowly recognizing something familiar. As we approached the terminal, the woman leaned forward slightly. "Have you ever driven to Ixmiquilpan before?" she asked, her voice carrying that same unidentifiable accent. My mouth went dry. "Yes," I managed to answer. "Once or twice." "The mountain road," the man added, not a question but a statement. "To the house with the stone pillars." I nodded, unable to speak further. They exchanged glances, a silent communication that seemed to contain volumes. "Would you be available to take us there tonight?" the woman asked. "The compensation would be significant." I declined as politely as I could, claiming prior commitments. They accepted my excuse without protest, but as they exited the taxi at the bus terminal, the man placed a business card on the seat. It bore no name, just a symbol I recognized from the stone pillars and a phone number. "If you change your mind," he said, "or for any future transportation needs, we value discretion and understanding." I've kept the card, though I haven't called the number. But sometimes on clear nights when certain stars align in configurations, I somehow now recognize, I feel an almost irresistible urge to drive toward those mountains, as if something is calling me, drawing me back to witness whatever transpires in that house of stars. The indigenous people of central Mexico have long spoken of los vigilantes del cielo, the watchers of the sky beings, neither human nor divine, who travel between stars and occasionally visit Earth at places where ancient peoples built observatories and temples. Colonial Spanish records mention native rituals performed on specific astronomical dates to communicate with these entities, rituals the conquerors suppressed as demonic practices. Modern astronomers have noted that certain pre-Columbian sites show knowledge of celestial events and alignments that should have been impossible without advanced technology. Some anthropologists suggest these cultures received this knowledge from somewhere or someone else. In remote villages throughout the Sierra Madre, elders still warn children not to wander the mountains on nights when certain stars align. They say those who witness the fire spirits dancing between heaven and earth become marked forever, divided between worlds, gradually drawn away from human concerns toward something vaster and more ancient than our brief civilization. If you ever find yourself driving dark roads in the Mexican highlands and see lights moving in ways that defy explanation, do not stop to watch. Do not attempt to record or photograph them. And if elegant strangers with unidentifiable accents request transportation to a remote gathering, politely decline. Some doors once noticed can never be completely ignored again, and those who pass through them rarely return unchanged, if they return at all. The Black Angel. I've spent most of my life on the road. My work demands constant travel between cities, delivering products directly to clients across central Mexico. I know every curve, every rest stop, and every dangerous stretch of highway in the region like the back of my hand. I've witnessed enough accidents to understand how fragile life becomes when you're controlling a ton of metal at high speeds. But no experience prepared me for what happened on that Christmas Eve drive from San Miguel de Allende. My name is Javier. I live in Querétaro, but frequently travel to surrounding cities like Guanajuato, Mexico City, and occasionally farther. I love my job, despite the time it keeps me away from my family. My wife, Marisol, has adjusted to my irregular schedule, but she always emphasizes the importance of family gatherings during holidays. That Christmas Eve, we had planned to meet at my parents' house at 3 in the afternoon. All my siblings and their families would be there, and Marisol had prepared her special pudding that everyone loved. I promised I would finish my deliveries early to arrive on time. I completed my final delivery around 4 o'clock, an hour later than planned. I called Marisol to let her know I was heading home, and she informed me that everyone had already started on the appetizers. I felt guilty about missing the beginning of our celebration, but at least I would make it for the main dinner and gift opening. As I was preparing to leave Guanajuato, my phone rang. It was Miguel, my boss, with an urgent last-minute delivery to San Miguel de Allende, a small package for a VIP client. Normally, I would have refused, but Miguel had helped me through a difficult financial period earlier that year, and San Miguel was only a small detour on my way home. I checked the supplies in my delivery van and confirmed I could fulfill the order. "I'll pay you double for this trip," Miguel promised, "and I guarantee you'll make it home in time for Christmas dinner." I reluctantly agreed, putting on a playlist of Christmas music to lift my spirits as I headed towards San Miguel. Despite my initial reluctance, I found myself humming along, thinking about the gathering that awaited me. Christmas Eve Noche Buena is more important than Christmas Day itself in Mexican culture. It's when families come together for the main celebration. A strange feeling of foreboding crept over me as I drove. Not fear exactly, but a heavy sense of significance, as if this particular Christmas Eve held special importance. I dismissed it as holiday melancholy, focusing instead on the road ahead. The delivery in San Miguel went smoothly. The client, an elderly businessman, was extremely grateful to receive the package on Christmas Eve and invited me to stay for dinner. I politely declined, explaining that my family was waiting. "At least have some warm wine before you go," he insisted, but I remained firm in my refusal. "Then take these pastries for your family," he said, handing me a box of traditional buñuelos. "And drive carefully. Something feels strange in the air tonight." His comment reinforced my own unease, but I thanked him and headed back to my van. Before leaving San Miguel, I stopped at a convenience store for coffee to help me stay alert on the drive home. It was nearly dark now, and I was determined to reach my family as quickly as safely possible. As I left the picturesque colonial town behind, the road narrowed and began to wind through hillier terrain. Anyone who has driven between San Miguel de Allende and Querétaro knows this particular stretch, a series of curves with only 2 lanes, one in each direction, that can be treacherous even in daylight. I was approaching one of these curves when I saw bright headlights in the distance. A large truck apparently stopped at the far end of the bend. The driver was flashing his high beams repeatedly as if warning of some hazard ahead. I slowed almost to a stop before entering the curve, concerned there might be an accident or obstacle in the road. The truck continued flashing its lights urgently. As I cautiously entered the curve, driving at a crawl now, the Christmas music on my radio suddenly cut out. Not just the music, all sound from the engine and the world outside seemed to vanish, leaving me in a bubble of absolute silence. The truck across the curve continued flashing its lights. Following standard driver courtesy, I flashed my own high beams in acknowledgement of whatever warning the other driver was trying to convey. When my high beams illuminated the curve ahead, I saw something that made my blood run cold. About 4 meters from the road stood a dark figure, humanoid, but wrong somehow. In the brief flash of light, I could only make out the lower half, what appeared to be legs dressed in black, but they weren't touching the ground. They hovered slightly above the road surface as if suspended in midair. I immediately cut my high beams, an inexplicable terror gripping me. Despite having no rational reason to be afraid, every instinct screamed danger. The truck across the way continued flashing desperately as if trying to communicate something urgent. "Is someone there?" I called out through my closed window, though I don't know why. The silence remained absolute. I couldn't even hear my own voice. My eyes strained in the darkness, trying to make out the figure more clearly. Something told me I shouldn't look directly at it, that seeing it fully would be dangerous somehow. Yet curiosity pulled at me with equal force. I reached behind my seat for the flashlight I kept for emergencies. As my hand closed around it, I felt, rather than heard, something move outside. The dark figure had shifted position, turning toward my vehicle. Against all better judgment, I opened my door and stepped out, flashlight in hand. I know now this was madness. One should never exit their vehicle on a dark highway for an unidentified figure. But in that moment I felt compelled by an irresistible curiosity that overrode my fear. Standing beside my van, I pointed the flashlight toward where I had seen the figure. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating nothing at first. I slowly swept it across the area and then froze as the light fell upon the figure. What I saw defies easy description. It was entirely black, not a person in black clothing as I had first thought, but a being composed of darkness itself, as if a shadow had gained 3 dimensions in substance. It stood tall and slender with no distinguishable features on what should have been a face. But most disturbingly, extending from its back were enormous wings, not feathered like an angel's or leathery like depictions of demons, but composed of the same absolute darkness as the rest of it, their structure only visible as slightly varied densities of black against black. The flashlight beam seemed to weaken where it touched the figure, as if the light was being absorbed rather than reflected. My hand trembled, causing the beam to dance erratically across the apparition. Across the curve, I could see the truck driver had exited his vehicle as well. He stood frozen, staring in the same direction as me, his face a mask of terror visible even at that distance. I wanted to run, to leap back into my van and drive away as fast as possible, but my body wouldn't respond. I stood transfixed, flashlight beam still trained on the dark angel. Then the world shifted. There's no other way to describe it. One moment I was standing on that dark highway, flashlight aimed at the winged figure, and the next I was back in my van, approaching the curve as if for the first time. The Christmas music played cheerfully through the speakers. My coffee sat steaming in the cup holder untouched. Disoriented and frightened, I nearly drove off the road before regaining control. Had I fallen asleep? Had I dreamed the entire encounter in a microsecond of road fatigue? But as I entered the curve, the same curve, I saw the truck again, flashing its lights in warning. The music cut out. The silence descended. This time, I didn't stop. Gripping the steering wheel with white knuckles, I accelerated through the curve, eyes fixed firmly on the road ahead, refusing to look to either side where the dark figure might stand. As I cleared the curve and approached the truck, I saw the driver's face clearly for the first time, pale with fear, eyes wide with recognition, as they locked with mine for a brief moment. We passed each other without stopping, two strangers united by a shared encounter with something beyond understanding. The music returned as I drove on, but I switched it off, needing silence to process what had happened. Had I experienced some kind of time loop, a hallucination, or something supernatural that defied explanation? When I finally arrived at my parents' house, it was nearly 11 at night. I had lost almost 7 hours somewhere between San Miguel and Querétaro, a drive that should have taken 1 hour at most. My family was frantic, having tried to call me repeatedly with no answer. My phone showed 45 missed calls and numerous text messages. I couldn't explain my absence. How could I tell them I had encountered what appeared to be a dark angel on the highway and somehow lost 7 hours in what felt like minutes? They would think I'd been drinking or worse. I made vague excuses about getting lost and having phone problems. No one believed me, of course, but they were so relieved to see me safe that they didn't press for details. My young nephews and nieces were opening their Christmas presents, the family celebration continuing despite my strange arrival. That night I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the winged figure, its featureless face, somehow staring directly into me despite having no visible eyes. I developed a fever that reached nearly 40 degrees concerning Marisol, enough that she wanted to take me to the hospital. I refused, knowing no doctor could treat what afflicted me. For weeks afterward, I suffered from nightmares and a persistent feeling of being watched. I avoided driving at night when possible, and I changed my route between Querétaro and Guanajuato to avoid that particular stretch of road, even if it meant adding an hour to my journey. I never told Marisol the full story, but my mother sensed something profound had happened. "You've seen something not meant for human eyes," she said quietly one day when we were alone. "I can see it in your face." 6 months after the encounter, I was driving near Querétaro when I spotted a familiar truck at a rest stop. Something pulled me to stop and investigate. The driver recognized me immediately, the man from Christmas Eve, the only other witness to what I had seen. We sat in a roadside diner, coffee cooling between us, as we finally spoke about our shared experience. "I've been driving that route for 30 years, he told me, his weathered face solemn. "I've seen accidents, landslides, even armed robberies, but I've never seen anything like what we encountered that night." "What do you think it was?" I asked, relieved to finally speak with someone who wouldn't dismiss my experience as imagination or fatigue. "In my grandmother's village they spoke of El Angel Negro, the Black Angel," he said, his voice dropping to nearly a whisper despite the empty diner. "Not an angel of heaven or hell, but something older, something that exists at crossroads, not just physical roads, but crossroads in time and fate. Why was it there that night?" He shrugged. Who can say? Perhaps it was waiting for someone specific. Perhaps it appears when certain stars align or when death is near." He studied me with sudden intensity. "Did you lose time that night?" Startled by his question, I nodded. 7 hours. It felt like minutes to me." "Same," he confirmed. "I arrived home in the morning, though I left my delivery point at sunset. My family thought I'd been in an accident or robbed." He rolled up his sleeve, revealing a strange mark on his forearm, a discoloration in the perfect shape of wings spread in flight. "This appeared the next day. Do you have one?" I hesitated, then turned slightly, lifting my shirt to show him the identical mark between my shoulder blades, a perfect wing-spread silhouette that had appeared the day after Christmas. "We've been marked," he said simply. "The angel Negro rarely reveals itself to people, but when it does, it leaves a sign." "For what purpose?" I asked, dread pooling in my stomach. "My grandmother would say we've been chosen as mensajeros, messengers, that eventually we'll be called to deliver something between worlds." He took a long sip of his coffee. "Or perhaps we're simply meant to warn others to be careful on dark highways during holy nights. I've never returned to that stretch of road between San Miguel de Allende and Querétaro. I've changed jobs to avoid long-distance driving altogether, taking a significant pay cut to work locally. Marisol doesn't understand my sudden career change, but she's supportive nonetheless. The wing-shaped mark on my back has faded somewhat over time, but it darkens noticeably during certain astronomical alignments and on Christmas Eve. During these periods, I'm plagued by dreams of flight dreams where I soar over landscapes both familiar and alien, seeing patterns and connections invisible from the ground. Most disturbing of all, I sometimes catch glimpses of wings in my shadow, not my shadow as it should be, but elongated and altered with great pinions extending from where no physical wings exist on my body. I see this most often at sunset when shadows stretch longest or under certain artificial lighting that casts multiple overlapping shadows. 2 months ago, my 6-year-old nephew asked me a question that chilled me to my core. We were in the backyard at dusk playing with a ball when he stopped suddenly staring at me with the direct curiosity only children possess. "Tio Javier," he said, "why do you have big black wings in your shadow when you don't have wings on your body?" I tried to laugh it off as imagination, but he remained insistent. "They're really big," he continued, untroubled by what should be an impossibility. "Like an angel's wings, but dark. Can you fly with them?" I've started seeing a therapist, hoping for a psychological explanation for these experiences. She suggests trauma stress, perhaps even a brief psychotic episode triggered by holiday pressure and driving fatigue. Her explanation should comfort me, but they don't account for the truck driver who shared my experience, the mark on my back that darkens and fades in cycles, or the wings my nephew sees in my shadow. Last week, I received a letter from the truck driver. His message was brief. "It's calling me back to the crossroads. If I don't return, look for me in the sky." I've tried calling the number he provided, but it's been disconnected. I fear he has returned to that curve in the road, to whatever waits there between worlds. As for me, I fight the growing urge to drive that route again, especially as Christmas approaches. Something is pulling me back to that spot, whispering that unfinished business awaits. Sometimes at night I find myself in my car keys in the ignition with no memory of having walked to the garage. They say those who encounter El Angel Negro are forever changed, marked not just physically but spiritually, their souls partially detached from the earthly plane. They say the mark is both blessing and curse, a sign of being chosen for something beyond human understanding. I don't know if I encountered a supernatural entity that Christmas Eve or if I experienced some kind of shared hallucination with a stranger. What I do know is that I no longer see the world as I once did. Patterns emerge in seemingly random events. Coincidences stack in ways that defy probability. And sometimes when I look at the night sky, I recognize configurations of stars I should have no knowledge of their positions speaking to me in a language I almost understand. If you find yourself driving a lonely road on a holy night and see headlights flashing in warning, heed them. If you glimpse something dark and winged at the edge of your vision, do not look directly at it. And if silence suddenly descends in a place that should be filled with sound, return to safety as quickly as you can. Some boundaries were never meant to be crossed by mortal eyes. Some messengers deliver tidings we were never meant to receive, and some angels, clothed in shadows rather than light, mark those they encounter not for salvation, but for purposes infinitely more mysterious. The wing-shaped mark between my shoulder blades is darkening again as Christmas approaches. I don't know what that means, but I've made Marisol promise to hide my car keys every night until the holiday passes, just in case the call becomes too strong to resist. In the folklore of central Mexico, El Angel Negro is described as a liminal entity that appears at crossroads, both literal intersections and figurative moments of decision or transition. Unlike the Christian concept of angels as messengers of God or fallen angels serving darkness, El Angel Negro belongs to a more ancient tradition predating Spanish colonization, where it was known as Ixtlilton, or the black face in Nahuatl, associated with fate and transformation. Encounters typically occur during significant celestial alignments or important religious dates when the boundaries between worlds are believed to be thinnest. Those who encounter the entity often report temporal anomalies, missing time or time loops, and many develop a mysterious mark resembling wings somewhere on their body. Modern parapsychologists have noted similarities between these accounts and reports of other entities worldwide that appear on roadways at night, suggesting a global phenomenon interpreted through different cultural lenses. Skeptics point to highway hypnosis, microsleeps, or shared delusions triggered by sensory deprivation and roadway monotony as potential explanations. Whatever the truth, drivers in central Mexico still warn each other to avoid certain stretches of lonely highway during holy days and nights of astronomical significance, particularly if they value the life they currently know and wish it to remain unchanged. Never pray during a storm. There are certain rules you learn growing up in my grandmother's house. Don't leave shoes upside down, don't sweep at night, don't look too long in mirrors after dark. But the one rule I remember most clearly, the one that still sends shivers down my spine 20 years later, was this: never pray during a thunderstorm. My name is Elena. When I was 13, my grandmother Magdalena passed away suddenly from a heart attack. She had been a powerful presence in our family, stern but loving, with a wealth of knowledge about the old ways, the traditions and superstitions that had been passed down through generations in our small coastal Mexican town. When she died, it left a hole not just in our hearts, but in our connection to those traditions. A few months after her funeral, my parents and aunts and uncles decided to gather at her house to begin the difficult process of sorting through her belongings and preparing the property for sale. It was a beautiful old colonial-style home on the edge of town, where the neatly arranged streets gave way to wild forest. The house had been in our family for generations, and selling it felt like severing another link to our past. I remember arriving there on a Friday afternoon in June, the air heavy with humidity that promised rain later. My parents brought me and my younger sister Sophia, who was 11 at the time. My uncle Carlos brought his sons Lucas, who was 11, and Miguel, the baby of the family, at just 9. My Aunt Teresa and her husband came too, though they had no children. It was the first time all the cousins had been together since the funeral. While the adults immediately set to work sorting through closets and cabinets, debating which items to keep, sell, or donate, we children were left to our own devices. The house was perfect for games of hide and seek, with its many rooms, large furniture, and hidden nooks. Miguel, being the youngest, often wanted to stay close to the adults, but Lucas, Sophia, and I were eager explorers. By late afternoon, dark clouds had gathered, and the first rumble of thunder announced the arrival of the summer storm we'd been expecting. The adults, deeply engrossed in their task, decided we would all stay the night rather than drive back in the downpour. This was exciting news for us children, an impromptu sleepover in grandmother's mysterious old house. As the storm intensified, the electricity flickered and finally went out completely. My aunt found candles and oil lamps that grandmother had always kept ready for such occasions, and soon the house was lit with a warm golden glow that made the shadows dance on the walls. It created a perfect atmosphere for scary stories. We gathered in the basement, a large, dry room with comfortable old furniture that grandmother had converted into a second living space, a refuge from the intense summer heat, or as now, from storms. The adults brought down blankets and pillows, telling us we would sleep there while they took the bedrooms upstairs. "Don't stay up too late," my mother warned as the adults retreated upstairs, leaving us with a few battery-powered lanterns to supplement the candles. Of course, the moment they were gone, Lucas suggested we tell ghost stories. He went first, launching into a tale about a shadowy figure he claimed to have seen in the forest behind grandmother's house years ago, La Dama de Negro, the woman in black. She was tall and thin. Lucas described his face eerily illuminated from below by the lantern. She just stood there among the trees, watching me. I ran inside and told grandmother, and she got really serious. She made me stay inside for the rest of the day and put salt on all the windowsills. "You're making that up?" Sophia accused, though she had inched closer to me on the sofa. "I'm not," Lucas insisted. "Ask your mom if you don't believe me." Grandmother told her about it. The storm outside had reached its peak, rain lashing against the small basement windows, thunder booming so loudly it seemed to shake the foundation of the house. Between thunderclaps, we could hear the wind howling through the trees. "This storm is worse than I thought," Miguel said nervously, clutching a pillow to his chest. "It'll pass," I assured him, trying to sound more confident than I felt. The intensity of the storm was unusual even for our region's summer weather. As the night grew later, we eventually tired of ghost stories and began to prepare for sleep. That's when Teresa, my 11-year-old cousin, did something that would change everything. She knelt down beside her makeshift bed and began to recite the Lord's Prayer. "Our Father, who art in heaven," she began. Lucas, who had been arranging his blankets nearby, suddenly froze. "Wait, stop," he said sharply. "Don't you remember what Grandmother always said, never pray during a thunderstorm?" Teresa paused, looking confused. "That's a silly superstition. My mom says we should pray when we're afraid, and this storm is scary." "But why would Grandmother say that if there wasn't a reason?" I asked, the old rule surfacing in my memory. Grandmother had been insistent about this particular prohibition, though she had never explained why. "Because old people have weird ideas," Teresa said dismissively, and continued her prayer. Feeling suddenly uneasy, I moved to the small basement window that was set high in the wall just above ground level. Through the rain-streaked glass, I could see the edge of the forest behind the house, intermittently illuminated by lightning flashes. And there, in one brilliant flash, I saw something that made my heart skip, a dark figure standing at the forest's edge, perhaps 30 meters from the house. "There's someone out there," I whispered, not wanting to frighten the others, but unable to keep the discovery to myself. They all rushed to the window, jostling for position to see out into the storm. "I don't see anything," Lucas said after a moment. "Wait for the next lightning," I instructed. We stood silently watching. When lightning next split the sky, we all saw it, a tall, slender silhouette in what appeared to be a long dark dress or coat, standing perfectly still, despite the raging wind and rain. "Who would be out in this weather?" Sophia whispered, her voice trembling slightly. "Maybe it's just a tree," Miguel suggested, though he didn't sound convinced. "Trees don't stand like that," Lucas countered, "and trees don't wear clothes." Teresa had abandoned her prayer and joined us at the window. "I don't like this," she admitted. "Should we tell the adults?" Before anyone could answer, another flash of lightning revealed that the figure had moved. It was now closer to the house, perhaps 20 meters away, still facing directly toward us. "It's coming toward us," Miguel gasped, backing away from the window. Teresa resumed her prayer, perhaps seeking comfort in the familiar words, "Hallowed be thy name, thy kingdom come." I kept my eyes fixed on the darkness outside, waiting for the next illumination. When it came, my blood ran cold. The figure had advanced again, now standing only about 10 meters from the house. Though still too distant to make out clearly, there was something wrong about its proportions, something unnaturally elongated about its silhouette. "Teresa, stop praying," I said, suddenly a connection forming in my mind. "Every time you pray, it comes closer." "That's ridiculous," she responded, but her voice wavered with uncertainty. "Just try," Lucas urged. "Stop for a minute and let's see if it moves again." Teresa fell silent, and we all returned our attention to the window. For several flashes of lightning, the figure remained stationary at its 10-meter distance from the house. It was close enough now that we could see it was definitely feminine in form, with long dark hair that hung limply in the rain. "See," I whispered, "it stopped moving when you stopped praying." "That doesn't make sense," Teresa argued, but she made no move to resume her prayer. We stood in tense silence, watching the figure through consecutive lightning flashes. It remained in place as if waiting. The storm continued unabated around it, but the figure stood unnaturally still, seemingly untouched by the elements. "What do we do now?" Sophia asked, her voice small. "We should get the adults," Miguel suggested. "Let's test it first," Lucas said, his scientific curiosity overriding his fear. "Teresa, say just one line of the prayer. Just one sentence, and let's see what happens." Teresa hesitated, then nodded. "Our Father who art in heaven," she recited clearly. We all turned back to the window, breath held in anticipation. When lightning next flashed, a collective gasp escaped us. The figure had moved significantly closer now, standing perhaps only 5 meters from the basement window, close enough that we should have been able to make out facial features. But where a face should have been, there was only a dark void, a shadowy blankness that absorbed the lightning's glare rather than reflecting it. It moved. Miguel cried out, retreating further from the window. It really moved when you prayed. Teresa backed away as well, her skepticism crumbling in the face of undeniable evidence. That's impossible, she whispered. Prayer is supposed to protect us from evil, not attract it. Maybe it's not evil, Lucas suggested, though his voice shook. Maybe it's something else, something that responds to prayer. Whatever it is, I don't want it any closer, I declared, pulling the others away from the window. No more praying until the storm passes. We retreated to the center of the basement, huddling together on the old sofa. The lantern batteries were beginning to dim, and the candles had burned low, casting the room in increasingly deep shadows. None of us wanted to approach the window again to check if the figure remained where we'd last seen it. Why would Grandmother say never to pray during a storm? Sophia wondered aloud. What did she know about... Whatever that is, maybe it's La Llorona, Miguel suggested, referring to the legendary weeping woman of Mexican folklore. Lucas shook his head. La Llorona wanders near water looking for her children. This is something else. What if it can get inside? Teresa asked, voicing the fear we'd all been harboring. As if in answer, we heard a new sound beneath the storm's chaos, a slow, deliberate scratching at the basement window. It was faint but unmistakable, like fingernails dragging across the glass. We froze, straining to hear. The scratching continued, methodical and patient. It wants in, Sophia whispered, tears of fear welling in her eyes. The scratching stopped abruptly, replaced by a soft tapping, gentle, almost polite, like someone requesting entry. Then, most terrifying of all, a voice, faint but discernible, feminine, but wrong somehow, as if the speaker had forgotten how human voices should sound. "Let me in," it called, the words slightly distorted, as if spoken underwater. "I'm caught in the storm. Please let me in." The voice was eerily similar to Teresa's, as though it was mimicking her. None of us moved or responded, frozen in collective terror. "I know you're in there," the voice continued, its tone shifting to something harder, more insistent. "I can see you. Let me in now." The tapping resumed more forcefully this time, accompanied by a low, inhuman moan that seemed to express centuries of frustration and hunger. "We need the adults," Miguel whispered, tears streaming down his face. "I'll go," I volunteered, being the oldest. "The rest of you stay together." I crept toward the basement stairs, careful to give the window a wide berth. As I reached the bottom step, a particularly violent thunderclap shook the house, and in the momentary silence that followed, we heard footsteps above someone walking heavily across the first floor. "Mom, Dad," I called upward, hoping it was one of the adults coming to check on us. No response came, only the continued sound of slow, deliberate footsteps moving across the ceiling. Then, most chilling of all, we heard the unmistakable creak of the basement door opening at the top of the stairs. I scrambled back to the others, all of us huddling together on the sofa as we stared at the staircase. The footsteps descended slow and measured, but we could see no one in the dim light. "Who's there?" Lucas called, trying to sound brave despite his trembling voice. The footsteps stopped. For a long, terrible moment, silence reigned. Then from halfway down the stairs, the voice spoke again, that same distorted feminine tone, but closer now, no longer muffled by glass and storm. "You should not have prayed," it said softly. "You called and I answered. That is the bargain." Teresa began to sob quietly. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I didn't know." A cold laugh drifted down from the staircase. "Ignorance doesn't void the invitation. Prayer opens doors during storms, doors that should remain closed." A particularly bright flash of lightning illuminated the staircase for a split second, revealing a tall, gaunt female figure in a sodden black dress, her face a featureless void where features should be, her hair hanging in wet ropes around the blank oval of her head. Then darkness returned, and in that darkness we heard her resume her descent. What happened next remains a blur in my memory. I remember screaming. I remember the lantern flying through the air. Lucas must have thrown it toward the stairs. I remember the sound of shattering glass and sudden flame as the lantern broke, spilling its oil, which ignited from the candles. The fire spread quickly to the aged carpet on the stairs, creating a barrier of flame between us and the descending entity. In the flickering light, I caught glimpses of a tall shadow retreating up the stairs, seeming to dissolve into the darkness beyond the flames. The adults came running then, alerted by our screams and the fire. My father and uncle quickly extinguished the flames before they could spread further, while our mothers gathered us, demanding explanations for the broken lantern in the fire. Through tears and terror, we tried to explain what we'd seen, what we'd heard. The adults exchanged glances I couldn't interpret at the time, not disbelief as I'd expected, but something closer to grim recognition. "It's our fault," my mother said to the others. "We should have told them. Magdalena always said they needed to know." "Know what?" I demanded. "What was that thing? Why did grandmother say never to pray during storms?" My father sat heavily on the sofa beside us, looking suddenly older in the dim light. "Your grandmother had an encounter when she was young," he explained slowly. "Something she saw during a storm much like this one." "La Dama de Negro," Lucas whispered. "It was real. Grandmother really saw her." My aunt nodded solemnly. She never told us everything that happened that night, but she was clear about the rule: never pray during thunderstorms, especially not in this house. "But why?" Teresa asked, her earlier skepticism completely gone. "Why would prayer attract something like that?" Magdalena believed that during powerful storms, especially here where the forest meets civilization, the boundary between worlds grows thin, my uncle explained. Prayer is a call that reaches across that boundary, but not everything that hears is what you might expect. Some entities use prayer as a beacon, a way to locate potential doorways. "And the woman we saw?" I asked. "Not a woman," my aunt said quietly, "at least not anymore. According to your grandmother, it was once human long ago. Now it's something else, something that waits in the space between lightning strikes, listening for invitations." We children slept together in the living room that night, surrounded by our parents. Every light in the house turned on once the electricity returned. No one suggested returning to the basement. No one mentioned the scorch marks on the stairs, or the long, wet footprints we'd found leading from the basement window to the stairs, footprints that had somehow come through solid glass without breaking it. The storm continued through the night, but no one prayed. Instead, my father kept watch with an old shotgun across his lap, though I suspected even then that conventional weapons would offer little protection against our visitor. By morning the storm had passed, leaving a world washed clean and bright in the summer sun. We left grandmother's house that day, the sorting of her belongings half finished. My parents and aunts and uncles never returned to complete the task, instead hiring professionals to empty the house before selling it to a family from out of town. I've never told this story to anyone outside our family. Even with my own children, I'm careful how I explain the rule: never pray during thunderstorms. They think it's just one of those quirky family traditions, like my insistence on salt lines at doorways during particularly violent weather, or the small bags of protective herbs I hang in their bedrooms. But sometimes when lightning illuminates their faces as they look out windows at summer storms, I catch a flicker of something in their expressions, an instinctive recognition perhaps that some rules exist for reasons beyond rational explanation, that some boundaries are not meant to be crossed even unintentionally, that prayer, like all forms of invitation, should be offered with care for what might answer. In the folklore of coastal Mexico, there exist tales of La que espera en la tormenta, she who waits in the storm. Unlike better-known entities like La Llorona, This figure doesn't actively search for victims, but rather waits patiently at the boundaries between worlds, listening for inadvertent invitations. Prayer during electrical storms is particularly dangerous, according to these traditions, as the electromagnetic disruption weakens the barriers between realms, allowing entities to perceive potential doorways into our world. What appears as a woman without a face is merely the form most comprehensible to human perception, an approximation of something far more ancient and alien. Those who survive encounters report that the entity cannot enter homes uninvited, but can use various forms of manipulation to secure invitation, mimicking familiar voices, creating illusions of danger from which it offers shelter, or exploiting human compassion for those caught in storms. The most effective protections, according to those who maintain the old ways, include salt barriers at thresholds, iron implements near windows and doors, and most importantly, absolute silence during the height of electrical storms. No prayers, no invocations, no requests for protection that might be intercepted by listeners never meant to hear them. Modern meteorologists note that certain geographical areas experience unusual electromagnetic phenomena during thunderstorms, creating conditions that can affect human perception and even consciousness. Whether this explains centuries of similar encounters across cultures remains a question for those brave enough or foolish enough to investigate. When lightning walks the sky and thunder shakes the boundaries between worlds we understand and those we don't. Never invite them in. I've lived nearly my entire life in Baja California, a land caught between desert and sea where ancient stories still pass from generation to generation by word of mouth. I grew up in a small village where everyone knew each other and doors were rarely locked. But despite how safe and friendly this place seemed, my mother always had one strict rule: never invite strangers into the house, especially at night. My name is Alejandra. When I was 10 years old, I experienced something that made me understand why my mother's warning was more than just routine parental caution. It was a lesson in the dangerous reality that sometimes lurks behind familiar appearances. Our home was a modest two-bedroom house, my parents in one room, my two older brothers and I in the other. However, after my brothers left for work opportunities in the United States, I found myself alone in what had once been a shared bedroom. Despite the empty beds left behind, I preferred sleeping on a small cot in the living room. The absence of my brothers made their room feel hollow and sad, filled with memories that only emphasized their absence. One summer night, I woke around 2 a.m. with an intense thirst. The heat had been oppressive that day, and the night brought little relief. I padded to the kitchen for a glass of water, the tile floor cool against my bare feet. As I stood drinking by the sink, I heard a soft knock at the front window. Startled, I nearly dropped the glass. Looking toward the sound, I saw a face peering in through the curtains, my cousin Lucia, who lived just a street away. "Alejandra, open the door," she called, her voice perfectly clear despite the closed window. "Quick!" I set down my glass and approached the window cautiously. Through the thin curtain, I could see Lucia's familiar outline. Her shoulder-length hair and slight frame were unmistakable in the faint moonlight filtering through our front yard. "Lucia," I asked, confused by her late-night appearance, "what are you doing here? Is something wrong with Aunt Teresa?" She didn't answer my questions. "Just open the door," she repeated, a strange urgency in her voice. "Please let me in." Something felt wrong. Although this was clearly Lucia, same voice, same appearance, there was an unusual quality to her presence. The way she stood too still, the slight tilt of her head, the intense focus with which she stared at me through the window glass. "I should wake my parents," I said, taking a step back toward their bedroom. "No." Lucia's response came too quickly, too sharply. "Don't wake them. I just need to talk to you. It's important." I hesitated, my hand on the doorknob. My mother's warning echoed in my mind: never invite strangers in, especially at night. But this wasn't a stranger, this was Lucia, my cousin, who I'd known my entire life. "Are you okay?" I asked, noticing how she made no move to explain why she was at our house in the middle of the night. "I'm fine," she answered with an odd mechanical smile. "Just open the door, Alejandra. Let me in." My hand remained frozen on the doorknob. Something deep inside me, some primal instinct beyond conscious thought, was screaming danger. I found myself searching for the keys, usually kept in a small bowl near the door, as if my body was acting on its own protective impulses. "Lucia, it's really late," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Can this wait until morning?" "Open the door," she repeated, her smile fading, her voice taking on a harder edge. "I'll tell your parents you wouldn't help me." The threat was subtle but clear, an attempt to manipulate me with childhood fears of getting in trouble. It was so unlike my gentle cousin that the wrongness of the situation solidified in my mind. I backed away from the door without unlocking it. Through the window I watched as Lucia's expression changed, not gradually as a human face would shift from one emotion to another, but in a sudden, terrible transformation. Her features seemed to melt, flowing like wax, until her face became a smooth, featureless oval with two deep black holes where eyes should be. Her mouth stretched into an impossibly wide grin, revealing teeth that were too long, too sharp, and too numerous for a human mouth. I screamed and stumbled backward, dropping the keys. The thing outside, not Lucia, never Lucia, pressed its distorted face against the window, that terrible grin widening further. "Won't you let me in?" it asked in a voice that still sounded like my cousin's, though now layered with something ancient and hungry. "Don't you want to be polite to family?" I ran to my parents' bedroom, tears of terror streaming down my face. My father woke instantly at my screams, while my mother took longer to rouse. Through choked sobs, I tried to explain what I'd seen, what was still at our front window. My father, a practical man who had never shown fear of anything, took his flashlight and walked determinedly to the front door. I clung to my mother, terrified of what might happen when he looked outside. He swung the door open, flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. After a moment of tense silence, he stepped onto the porch, sweeping the light across our front yard. "There's no one here," he called back to us. No sign of Lucia or anyone else. My mother held me tightly, murmuring comforting words, but I could feel the tension in her embrace. When my father returned, closing and locking the door behind him, my parents exchanged a look I couldn't interpret. Not disbelief as I had expected, but something more complicated, tinged with recognition. "You must have had a nightmare," my father suggested gently. "Been sleepwalking, perhaps." But my mother's expression told a different story. "Let's all sleep in our room tonight," she said, leading me toward their bedroom. That night I slept between my parents, something I hadn't done since early childhood. Despite their comforting presence, I barely slept, jerking awake at every sound from outside, every creak of our old house settling. In the morning light, everything seemed normal again. My father left for work, kissing my forehead and reminding me that nightmares, while frightening, couldn't hurt me. My mother, however, was quieter than usual as she prepared breakfast. When we were alone, she finally spoke about what had happened. "What you saw last night," she began, carefully sitting across from me at our small kitchen table. "Can you describe it again? Exactly what you saw, not what you think you saw." I recounted every detail: Lucia at the window, her strange behavior, the horrifying transformation of her face. My mother listened intently, her expression growing increasingly grave. "And she had kept asking you to invite it in to open the door," she pressed. I nodded. "She kept saying, 'Let me in,' over and over, even after her face changed." My mother closed her eyes briefly, as if confirming something she had feared. "Alejandra," she said, taking my hands in hers, "what you saw was a Nahuali, a shapeshifter. They are ancient beings that can take the form of people we know and trust." "Like werewolves?" I asked, trying to connect this to stories I knew. "No, much older and more dangerous than werewolves," she explained. "Nahuali have been in these lands since before the Spanish came. They cannot enter homes unless invited, which is why they take familiar forms to trick us into welcoming them. But it looked just like Lucia, I said, still struggling to understand. That's their power. My mother nodded. They can appear as anyone you know well enough to trust immediately. But there are always signs, little wrongnesses in their behavior, in how they move or speak. Your instincts recognize these signs even if your conscious mind couldn't name them. Is that why you always told us never to invite strangers in at night? Yes, she confirmed. Though Nahuali are not strangers in appearance, that's what makes them so dangerous. They look like friends, family, people we would naturally want to help. What would have happened if I had opened the door? I asked, though part of me didn't want to know the answer. My mother's face darkened. They feed on life essence, she said simply. They need a living host to exist in our world. Once invited in, they can replace a person, take over their body while pushing the original spirit aside. A chill ran through me despite the morning warmth. Has this happened before here in our village? Years ago, my mother admitted reluctantly. Before you were born, a family disappeared, parents, children, everyone. The house stood empty for months until distant relatives came to claim it. When they entered, they found nothing disturbed, no signs of violence or hasty departure. It was as if the family had simply vanished in the middle of their daily lives. Did a Nahuali take them? We believe so. There had been reports of strange encounters in the weeks before, familiar faces seen at odd hours behaving strangely. Your grandfather helped organize searches of the surrounding desert, but no trace was ever found. We sat in silence for a moment, the implications of her story settling over me like a heavy blanket. How do we protect ourselves? I finally asked. Salt at thresholds and windowsills helps, she replied. They cannot cross lines of pure salt. Iron also repels them. That's why we have the iron horseshoe above the front door. But the most important protection is awareness. Trust your instincts when something feels wrong, even if you can't explain why. Later that day, my cousin Lucia, the real Lucia, came to visit with Aunt Teresa. I watched her carefully, looking for any sign that she wasn't herself, but everything about her was normal. Her animated gestures when she talked, her habit of tucking hair behind her ear, the warmth in her eyes when she smiled at me. You look like you've seen a ghost, she commented when she caught me staring. Something like that, I murmured. When Aunt Teresa stepped outside with my mother, I pulled Lucia aside and asked if she had come to our house the previous night. Of course not, she laughed. I was home in bed like any normal person at 2 a.m. I hesitated, then described what I'd seen. Rather than dismissing my story, Lucia's face grew serious. My grandmother used to talk about things like that, she said quietly. Beings that could wear familiar faces. She called them face stealers and said they were most active during the new moon. She glanced toward the window. Last night was a new moon. That evening, my mother placed fresh lines of salt along all our doors and windows. She hung garlic, which I later learned was believed to reveal a Nahuali's true form, above the front door alongside the horseshoe. These small protections, which I'd always assumed were merely cultural traditions or superstitions, now took on profound importance. Weeks passed without incident. I gradually returned to sleeping in the living room, though I kept a small bag of salt under my pillow. The memory of that night remained vivid, but its sharp edges of terror were slowly dulling with time and distance. Then one evening, as dusk was falling, there came another knock. Not at the window this time, but at our front door. My parents were in the backyard, tending to my mother's small herb garden. I approached, cautiously remembering my encounter all too clearly. "Who is it?" I called without touching the door. "It's me, Mr. Ortiz, from down the street," came the reply. "I'm having car trouble and wondered if your father might help." Mr. Ortiz was an elderly neighbor who had lived in our village for decades. His request seemed reasonable. My father often helped neighbors with mechanical problems. Still, I remembered my mother's warnings and my own experience. "I'll get my father," I responded, turning toward the back door. "Wait!" The voice called, a new urgency entering it. could you let me in while you get him? It's getting dark and my arthritis is bothering me." I hesitated. Mr. Ortiz did indeed suffer from severe arthritis. Everyone in the village knew this. It would be cruel to leave an old man standing outside in discomfort. Yet something felt wrong again. Mr. Ortiz rarely ventured out after sunset, preferring the comfort of his home during evening hours. And his voice, though recognizable, carried a subtle wrongness, a rhythm slightly off pauses in unusual places. "I'm sorry," I said firmly. "My parents don't allow me to open the door when they're not present. I'll bring my father right away." There was silence from the other side of the door. Then so quietly I almost missed it, a sound like a hiss of frustration. I ran to the backyard and brought my parents inside, explaining the situation in hurried whispers. My father grabbed a flashlight and approached the door while my mother pulled me behind her protectively. When my father opened the door, the porch was empty. No Mr. Ortiz, no sign that anyone had been there at all. But on the wooden boards of our porch, just short of the salt line my mother had laid that morning, was a set of strange markings, not footprints, but elongated impressions that resembled no animal track I had ever seen. My father quickly closed and locked the door. "We need to call Mr. Ortiz," he said, his voice tight with concern. The phone call confirmed what we already suspected. Mr. Ortiz was safely at home, had been all evening, and had not come to our door seeking help. That night we slept with the lights on, all three of us, in my parents' room again. Outside, dogs barked frantically all night, as if something unseen prowled the village streets. Word spread quickly among the older residents. Without explicitly naming what had happened, a kind of communal vigilance descended on our village. Children were called home before sunset. Doors were checked twice before bedtime. Salt appeared in thin lines across doorways of houses that had never shown such precautions before. 2 weeks later, I was at the local market with my mother when we overheard troubling news. A family on the outskirts of the village had disappeared a young couple and their infant son. Their house stood empty, doors locked from the inside, car still in the driveway, half-prepared meal on the kitchen table. Just like the family my mother had described from years ago. The authorities suggested they had left voluntarily, perhaps due to debts or other troubles. But the older villagers exchanged knowing glances, and that night more salt lines appeared. More protective charms were hung. As for me, I never again opened a door without absolute certainty about who or what waited on the other side. I carried that caution into adulthood through college in La Paz, where I studied natural sciences, and into my current work at a shop selling herbal remedies and natural products. Now at 23, I've formed a friendship with a young tarot reader who often visits my shop. One day I shared my experience with the Nawali, expecting skepticism from someone educated in a more modern environment. "These entities still exist," he told me, not surprised at all by my story. "They are ancient beings, very ancient, from before the Spanish arrived. They cannot enter without invitation, but once invited they can cause terrible suffering." "How do they still exist after all this time?" I asked. "They feed on fear, loneliness, desperation," he explained. "They seek out vulnerable individuals, those isolated or in emotional distress. And in today's world, despite all our connectivity, there are more lonely people than ever before. I still wear the small bag of protective herbs my mother made for me when I was 10. I still place salt at my thresholds each night. And I still watch carefully for those subtle wrongnesses that might indicate someone I know is not who they appear to be. Because I understand now what my mother tried to teach me all those years ago, that the most dangerous predators are those that wear familiar faces, that seek invitation rather than forcing entry. They have patience born of centuries, willing to wait outside your door until a moment of compassion or carelessness grants them access. So I pass this warning to you. Be careful who you invite across your threshold, especially at night. If someone you know appears unexpectedly at your door, acting strangely, speaking oddly, watch their eyes carefully. The eyes reveal what the stolen face tries to hide. And if you ever see a face begin to change, features melting into a smooth, featureless mask, with nothing but dark holes where eyes should be, do not under any circumstances open your door. For some invitations once extended can never be withdrawn, and some guests once welcomed will never leave, not until they've taken everything, including the very essence of who you are. Sometimes when I glance quickly into a mirror late at night, I wonder if the woman looking back is truly me. I wonder if those brief moments when my reflection seems to move independently, or when my smile doesn't quite form as I intended, might indicate something watching from behind my eyes, something that gained access in a moment I can't remember. Then I shake away such thoughts as the product of an old childhood fear reinforced by a cultural superstition. At least that's what I tell myself on bright sunny days. But on moonless nights, when shapes seem to lurk just beyond my windows, I refresh the salt lines at my thresholds, check the iron above my door, and remind myself never to extend invitations to those who come calling after dark, whether stranger or familiar face. Because sometimes the old warnings contain more truth than our modern minds want to acknowledge. According to Mesoamerican folklore, Nahuali, sometimes called Nahual or Nagual, are shape-shifting entities dating back to pre-Columbian beliefs. Unlike European concepts of shapeshifters that change between human and animal forms, traditional Nahuali are spiritual entities capable of assuming the exact appearance of specific individuals. They observe a form of perfect mimicry rather than transformation. In traditional beliefs, these entities cannot enter dwellings without explicit invitation, which is why they take the forms of trusted individuals. The only ways to identify them are subtle behavioral inconsistencies, an unusual fixation on being invited inside, and their inability to cross protective barriers of salt iron or certain herbs. Modern folklorists note striking similarities between Nahuali legends and contemporary reports of doppelganger encounters worldwide, suggesting either a universal psychological phenomenon or, as some traditional knowledge keepers maintain, the continued existence of ancient entities that have adapted to modern environments. Protective measures against Nahuali traditionally include salt lines at thresholds, iron implements above doors and windows, garlic, which supposedly causes their disguise to waver, and most importantly, a household policy against admitting anyone, even apparent family members, during unusual hours, or when their behavior seems inconsistent with their known personality. Whether interpreted as literal beings or as metaphors for the dangers of misplaced trust, the Nahuali tradition teaches vigilance against deception and reminds us that predators often come disguised as something familiar and safe. The Weeping Christ. No one believes me when I tell them the statue cries. Even my girlfriend Camila, who accidentally witnessed it herself, thinks it was just a hallucination. But I know what I heard that night, the soft, pained sobbing coming from the room no one dared enter since Doña Esperanza passed away. My name is Mateo. I'm a second-year architecture student who had been dating Camila for about 6 months when everything happened. We met at an art exhibition where she was displaying some of her photography work. There was an immediate connection between us, and we'd been practically inseparable ever since. The story begins when Camila's grandmother, Doña Esperanza, died peacefully in her sleep at the advanced age of 92. She was a deeply religious woman who had lived alone in an old colonial house on the outskirts of the city. Camila had been very close to her abuela, and her death hit her hard. After the funeral, Camila's mother, Señora Guadalupe, had to travel for work for several weeks, and she didn't want to leave Doña Esperanza's house unattended. Although the house would eventually be sold, that would take time, and meanwhile someone needed to care for the numerous potted plants and the pair of canaries that Doña Esperanza had loved so dearly. Camila volunteered to stay there for a few weeks, and I offered to join her, at least on weekends. I knew she was still grieving, and I didn't want her to face the empty house and its memories alone. Doña Esperanza's house was a classic colonial structure with thick walls, an interior courtyard filled with plants, and more rooms than a single elderly woman could possibly need. When we arrived on a Friday evening, I sensed an unusual heaviness in the air. Perhaps it was just the lingering scent of the strong perfume Doña Esperanza favored, a dense, flowery fragrance that seemed to have permeated the very walls. Camila gave me a tour of the house, showing me the living room with its antique furniture, the old-fashioned kitchen, and the bedroom where we would stay, Camila's childhood room when she used to visit. There was one door she didn't open, Doña Esperanza's master bedroom. "Mom locked that room," Camila explained when I asked. "We'll sort through her things when Mom returns. No need to disturb it now." I nodded, understanding that the room contained too many memories of her grandmother for Camila to face just yet. Our first evening passed normally. We cooked dinner, watched a movie on my laptop, and went to bed rather early. Camila looked exhausted, not just physically but emotionally drained, and I didn't want to disturb her. That night I woke around 3 a.m. with a powerful thirst. Camila was sleeping peacefully beside me, her breathing deep and regular. I carefully slipped out of bed and made my way to the kitchen for a glass of water. As I passed by Doña Esperanza's bedroom, I heard a strange sound coming from inside. At first I thought it might be the wind slipping through a crack in the window, or perhaps a mouse scurrying in the walls. Old houses like this one often had such noises, but as I paused to listen, I realized it was something else entirely. It sounded like crying, soft, rhythmic sobbing, like someone trying to contain their grief. "Camila," I called softly, thinking perhaps she had awakened while I was gone and entered the room for some reason. But I could still see the outline of her form in the bed when I glanced back down the hallway. I approached the door cautiously. "Is someone there?" I whispered. The crying immediately stopped, and a heavy silence filled the hallway. I tried the doorknob, but, as Camila had said, it was locked. I stood there for a moment, listening intently, but heard nothing more. Perhaps I had imagined it, my mind playing tricks in an unfamiliar house at night. I continued to the kitchen, drank my water, and returned to bed, chalking the experience up to an overactive imagination in a strange environment. Camila hadn't stirred, and I soon fell back asleep. The next day I mentioned the strange sounds to Camila over breakfast. "You must have been dreaming," she said, looking at me skeptically. "This house makes all kinds of noises at night. The wind catches in the eaves and sounds like whispers sometimes." "I was completely awake," I insisted. "I heard crying coming from your grandmother's room. It sounded human." Camila's expression showed she wasn't convinced. "The room is locked, Mateo. No one could be in there." I let the matter drop, not wanting to upset her. We spent the day cleaning and organizing other parts of the house, taking care of the canaries and watering the numerous plants in the courtyard. As evening approached, Camila seemed more relaxed than she had been since her grandmother's passing. That night we both slept soundly with no mysterious sounds to disturb our rest. By Sunday afternoon, when I had to return to the city for Monday classes, I had almost forgotten the incident. "I'll be back next weekend," I promised, as I kissed Camila goodbye. "Call me any time if you need anything." "I'll be fine," she assured me with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. This was my second home growing up. I know every corner of it. Throughout the week we spoke daily by phone. Camila seemed to be adjusting to life in her grandmother's house, though she admitted the silence could be oppressive at times. By Friday, I was eager to return, both to see her and to escape the cramped university dormitory I shared with 2 other students. When I arrived Friday evening, Camila greeted me with a tight hug that spoke volumes about her loneliness during the week. We prepared dinner together, and afterward she showed me some of the old photographs she'd found while sorting through a cabinet in the study images of Doña Esperanza as a young woman, of Camila's mother as a child, and of Camila herself growing up through the years. As we sat looking through these memories, a sudden rainstorm began, drops pounding against the tile roof and windows. The old house seemed to creak and settle around us as if the rain had awakened it. "It always sounds alive during storms," Camila remarked, glancing up at the ceiling. "Abuela used to say the house was breathing." We went to bed early again, the rhythmic sound of rain on the roof lulling us to sleep. But once more I woke in the middle of the night. This time it wasn't thirst that roused me, but a distinct feeling of being watched. I opened my eyes to the darkness of the room, momentarily disoriented. As my eyes adjusted, I became aware of a sound, the same soft crying I had heard the previous weekend. It was coming from the hallway again, from the direction of Doña Esperanza's room, but louder now, more distinct. It wasn't the sound of rain or wind or the house settling. It was unmistakably human sobbing, punctuated by what sounded like whispered prayers. I sat up in bed, straining to hear. Camilla slept on beside me undisturbed. I carefully got out of bed and moved to the door, which was slightly ajar. The crying continued, a heartbreaking sound of deep sorrow. My rational mind suggested that perhaps someone had broken into the house and was hiding in the locked room. But why would an intruder be crying? And how would they have gotten into a locked room without leaving any signs of forced entry? I stepped into the hallway, the old wooden floor cool beneath my bare feet. The crying was unmistakable now, coming from behind Doña Esperanza's door. I approached slowly, still unsure what I might find. "Hello?" I called softly, not wanting to wake Camilla but needing to know who or what was making those sounds. The crying stopped immediately, replaced by a heavy silence. Then, to my surprise, I heard the sound of movement inside the room, something or someone shifting position. I tried the doorknob again, expecting it to be locked as before. To my shock, it turned easily in my hand. The door swung open, revealing the darkened bedroom beyond. The room smelled of the same heavy perfume that permeated the house, but stronger here, more concentrated. Moonlight filtered through the curtains, casting long shadows across the meticulously made bed, the antique dressing table with its collection of perfume bottles, and the reading chair by the window, with an open book still resting on its arm, as if Doña Esperanza had just stepped away for a moment. But what immediately captured my attention was the large wooden crucifix hanging on the wall opposite the bed. It was life-sized, the carved Christ figure detailed and expressive. His face turned upward in agony, his body contorted in suffering. In the dim moonlight, the figure seemed almost to move the shadows, playing across the wooden surface in unsettling ways. I stood transfixed, staring at the crucifix. As my eyes adjusted further to the darkness, I noticed something odd. There appeared to be a glistening trail running from the Christ figure's eyes down the wooden cheeks. It caught the moonlight, shimmering slightly. I stepped closer, drawn by morbid curiosity. Could it be? I reached out a hand toward the crucifix, wondering if those were actual tears on the wooden face. "Don't touch it." The sharp command from the doorway made me jump. I spun around to see Camilla standing there, clutching her robe closed at the throat, eyes wide with alarm. "What are you doing in here?" she demanded, her voice trembling slightly. "The door was open," I explained, gesturing helplessly. "I heard crying again, and when I checked, the door opened." "That's impossible," Camilla said, stepping into the room. "Mom locked it before she left. She has the only key." "Well, it wasn't locked just now," I insisted. "Camilla, look at the crucifix. I think it's—" "I don't care what you think it is," she interrupted, her voice suddenly cold. "This is my grandmother's room. You shouldn't be in here." She practically pushed me out of the room and pulled the door shut behind us with a decisive click. I stood in the hallway, bewildered by her reaction. "Camilla, there was something on that crucifix. It looked like—" "It was just a trick of the light," she snapped, "or condensation from the walls. This is an old house with humidity problems." Her explanation made logical sense, but it didn't match what I'd seen, what I thought I'd seen. And it certainly didn't explain the crying I'd heard twice now from this supposedly empty room. "But what about the crying?" I pressed. "You must have heard it too." "I didn't hear anything," she said, but her eyes darted away as she spoke, avoiding mine. "You were probably dreaming again." We returned to bed, but an uncomfortable tension had settled between us. Camilla lay with her back to me, rigid and distant. I stared at the ceiling, replaying the scene in my mind. What had I really seen in that dim room? Was it possible that a wooden statue could cry? And if not, what had made those sounds of grief? The next morning, Camila was unusually quiet as she prepared breakfast. I approached her cautiously, aware that I had somehow crossed a boundary the night before. "I'm sorry about last night," I offered. "I shouldn't have gone into your grandmother's room without permission." She nodded stiffly, accepting my apology without looking up from the eggs she was scrambling. "It's just that room is private. Those were her personal things." "I understand," I said gently, "but Camila, I really did hear someone crying. And the crucifix." "Stop it, Mateo." She put down the spatula and finally met my eyes. "There's nothing supernatural happening here. It's just an old house with strange acoustics and normal wear and tear on old religious objects. Let it go." I wanted to press further, but recognized the pain behind her irritation. This house held precious memories of her grandmother, and my suggestions of something unexplainable were perhaps threatening the peace she was trying to make with her loss. The rest of the day passed in strained politeness. We went through the motions of our usual weekend activities, watering plants, cleaning, preparing meals, but the easy companionship we normally shared was noticeably absent. By Sunday afternoon, the tension had begun to ease slightly. Camila needed to go into town to meet a potential photography client, and I stayed behind to cook dinner, hoping to restore some normalcy to our weekend. While she was out, I found myself drawn again to Doña Esperanza's bedroom door. I stood before it hesitating. Would it still be unlocked? Part of me wanted to check to validate my experience from the previous night. But another part, the part that respected Camila's boundaries, held me back. A strange sound from inside the room made the decision for me. It wasn't crying this time, but a soft shuffling like fabric brushing against the floor, followed by a quiet exhalation of breath. Heart pounding, I tried the doorknob. It turned easily, the door swinging open as it had the night before. The room was exactly as I remembered it, bathed now in the golden light of late afternoon rather than moonlight. The crucifix hung imposingly on the wall, the carved Christ figure seeming to watch me as I entered. I approached it cautiously, studying the wooden face. In the clearer light of day, I could see that the wood was old but well preserved, the craftsmanship exceptional in its detail. The expression of suffering was masterfully captured, the upturned eyes seeming to plead with heaven. And there, unmistakable even in daylight, was a glistening trail running from the figure's eyes down the wooden cheeks. Not condensation, not a trick of the light, actual moisture, as if the wooden statue had been weeping. I reached out to touch it, my fingertips hovering just above the tear track. Before I could make contact, I heard the front door open and close. Camila had returned earlier than expected. I quickly backed away from the crucifix and left the room, pulling the door closed behind me. But I wasn't quite fast enough. When I turned, Camila was standing at the end of the hallway, watching me with an unreadable expression. "You were in her room again," she said flatly. "The crucifix is crying, Camila," I replied, deciding honesty was the only approach left. "I saw it clearly this time. There are actual tears on the wooden face." She stared at me for a long moment, then brushed past me and opened the bedroom door herself. I followed her in, ready to point out the evidence. But as we both looked at the crucifix, I was stunned to see that the tear tracks I'd observed just moments before were gone. The wooden face was dry, showing no signs of the moisture I had so clearly seen. "There's nothing there, Mateo," Camila said, her voice a mixture of concern and exasperation. "I think you're letting your imagination run wild." I stood speechless, doubting my own perceptions. Had I imagined it? Was my mind playing elaborate tricks on me? "I know what I saw," I finally said, though with less conviction than before. "Both last night and just now. And I've heard crying from this room twice." Camila sighed heavily and sat on the edge of her grandmother's perfectly made bed. "Mateo, I need to tell you something. Something Abuela told me when I was young." I sat beside her, waiting. "This crucifix," she began, gesturing toward the wooden Christ, was special to Abuela. She brought it from her village church when she was young. She always said it was different from other religious objects. Different how? I prompted when she hesitated. She said it wept, Camilla admitted reluctantly, that it cried the night her first husband died in a mining accident. She said she took it from the church afterward because she believed it needed a home, that it felt things too deeply to remain in a public space. I stared at her, processing this revelation. So you believe me? You've known all along that it cries? Camilla shook her head. I always thought they were just stories, the kind of superstitious tales the elderly tell. I never actually believed it could happen. Well, and she looked up at the crucifix. Until the night Abuela died. What happened? I asked softly. I was with her, Camilla confessed, her voice barely above a whisper. I was the only one here, and as she slipped away, I heard the crucifix weeping. I actually heard it, but I told myself it was just my imagination, that I was grieving and exhausted, and my mind was playing tricks on me. But you've heard it since then, I guessed. She nodded slowly. Sometimes at night. But I don't want to believe it's real. Because if it is, if the crucifix really weeps, then what else from Abuela's stories might be true? What other stories? I asked, feeling we were finally approaching the heart of the mystery. Camilla hesitated, twisting her hands in her lap. Abuela she wasn't a Saint Mateo. She had secrets. Dark things she did when she was young, things she never shared with anyone but me, and only in fragments when her guard was down. What kind of things? I don't know the details, Camilla admitted. She never told me everything, but whatever it was, it haunted her throughout her life. It's why she became so religious, why she went to church every day and prayed constantly. She was trying to atone for something. I looked up at the crucifix, seeing it in a new light. And you think the crucifix weeps for her sins? That's what she believed, Camilla said. She said it wept for all suffering souls, for those carrying burdens of guilt and pain. She took a shaky breath. The night she died, when I heard it crying, I thought it was weeping for her passing. But what if it's weeping for her soul now? What if whatever she did was so terrible that even in death she can't find peace? The implications of her words hung heavy in the air between us. I reached for her hand, squeezing it gently in silent support. That's why I didn't want you in here, she continued. Not just because it's private, but because I was afraid of what you might discover, afraid you'd hear it too, and I'd have to face the possibility that it's all real. We sat in silence for a moment, both looking at the crucifix on the wall. In the late afternoon light, it appeared completely ordinary, just an old, well-crafted religious artifact with no supernatural qualities whatsoever. Do you think it only cries at night? I asked eventually. I don't know, Camilla replied. Abuela said it cried when it felt pain, either its own or the pain of others. I've only ever heard it after dark. That night we decided to remain in our room rather than investigate further. Camilla was emotionally exhausted from our conversation, and I didn't want to press the issue. But as we lay in bed, I couldn't help listening for sounds from down the hall. Around midnight it began again, the soft, sorrowful sobbing that had first drawn me to the room. This time it was accompanied by whispered prayers in Spanish, too faint for me to make out the words. I felt Camilla stiffen beside me, and I knew she heard it too. You hear it now, don't you? I whispered. She nodded, her face pale in the dim light filtering through the curtains. It sounds like Abuela's prayers, the ones she would say every night before bed. We lay listening to the heartbreaking sound of weeping and whispered devotions. After a few minutes, Camilla sat up decisively. We need to go in there, she said. We need to see it for ourselves. Together we got out of bed and moved quietly down the hallway. The door to Doña Esperanza's room stood slightly ajar, a thin line of moonlight spilling out onto the hallway floor. The crying continued, oblivious to our approach. Camilla pushed the door open wider and we stepped into the room. The moonlight streaming through the window illuminated the crucifix on the wall, and even from the doorway we could see the glistening trails of moisture on the wooden face of Christ. The sound of weeping seemed to emanate directly from it, filling the room with palpable sorrow. "It's true," Camilla whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "It really does cry." We moved closer, approaching the crucifix with a mixture of awe and trepidation. Up close, the tears were unmistakable, actual droplets of clear liquid running down the carved wooden cheeks, catching the moonlight like diamonds before falling to the floor below. "What do we do?" I asked, unsure how to respond to such an inexplicable phenomenon. Camilla surprised me by kneeling before the crucifix as if in prayer. After a moment's hesitation, I joined her on the floor. "I know my grandmother did something terrible." Camilla began addressing the crucifix directly. "I know she carried that guilt throughout her life. But she was also a good person who tried to make amends. She was kind and generous and loving. I hope she's found peace now." As she spoke, another tear formed and fell from the wooden eye of the Christ figure, landing with a tiny, audible splash on the floor. "I don't know if you can hear my grandmother wherever she is now," Camilla continued, her voice stronger, "but if you can please tell her she's forgiven, that whatever she did, she paid for it with a lifetime of repentance." The weeping sound grew softer, the whispered prayers fading to near inaudibility. The room felt different, somehow lighter, as if a heavy presence was gradually lifting. "And if you weep for suffering souls," Camilla concluded, "then please don't weep for my abuela anymore. Let her rest in peace." As she finished speaking, the final tear fell from the wooden face. The room fell completely silent, the oppressive feeling that had permeated the house since our arrival noticeably diminishing. The air itself seemed to lighten, the heavy scent of Doña Esperanza's perfume fading slightly. We remained kneeling for several minutes watching the crucifix. No more tears formed. No more sounds of weeping or prayer disturbed the night. Eventually we rose and quietly left the room, closing the door softly behind us. Back in our bedroom, Camilla turned to me, her expression a mixture of wonder and relief. "Thank you," she said simply. "For what?" I asked. "For believing what you heard and saw, for making me face it instead of hiding from it." She smiled faintly. I think whatever was holding Abuela here might be gone now. I think she might finally be at peace." We slept deeply that night, undisturbed by supernatural sounds. In the morning the house felt different, brighter, more welcoming, as if a shadow had been lifted. When we checked Doña Esperanza's room, the crucifix hung serenely on the wall, its wooden face completely dry, showing no evidence of the tears we had witnessed. The following week, Camila's mother returned from her business trip. We helped her begin the process of sorting through Doña Esperanza's belongings, preparing the house for eventual sale. When it came to the crucifix, Camila insisted on keeping it. "Abuela would want me to have it," she told her mother, who seemed surprised by her daughter's attachment to the religious artifact. Now the crucifix hangs in Camila's small apartment living room. It has never wept again since that night, at least not that we've observed. But sometimes when I spend the night there and wake in the early morning hours, I think I hear a soft sigh from the direction of the wooden figure, not sorrowful, but peaceful, like someone finally at rest. Camilla's grandmother once told her that the crucifix had been in her village's church for generations before she took it. According to local legend, it was carved in the early colonial period by an indigenous artisan who had lost his family to European diseases. The wood came from a tree that grew over a pre-Columbian sacred spring, a place where the boundary between worlds was said to be particularly thin. The tradition of weeping statues exists across many Catholic countries, particularly in Latin America. Most are explained away as natural phenomena, condensation oil seepage from the wood, or deliberate hoaxes. But some remain inexplicable by conventional means defying scientific analysis. In the folklore of rural Mexico, objects that absorb intense human emotion, particularly guilt, grief, or devotion, can become vessels for spiritual energy. These objects are said to react to similar emotions in their vicinity, serving as conduits between the living and the dead, particularly for souls unable to find rest due to unresolved matters in life. Whether you believe in supernatural phenomena or prefer rational explanations, there remains something profoundly moving about the idea that our pain might be witnessed and shared, that somewhere something might weep for us in our darkest moments, acknowledging our suffering when we feel most alone. And perhaps there is comfort in knowing that even the deepest guilt, the most burdensome secret, might eventually find release, if not through divine forgiveness, then through the compassion of those who come after us, who choose to remember not just our failures, but our attempts at redemption. La Sirena. I still remember the warm summer winds that brought me back to Molendo, the coastal town where I witnessed that horrifying thing 20 years ago. Every time I sit by the shore at dusk, I still feel a chill run down my spine, a reminder that I once encountered something no one should ever meet and survived to tell the story. My name is Miguel. When the incident occurred, I was 14 years old, living in the small coastal town of Molendo in the Arequipa region of Peru. At that age, I was in that transitional phase between childhood and adulthood, my mind filled with dreams of adventure and a desire to explore. Molendo is a modest town with wild, unspoiled beaches and dramatic cliffs where the Pacific Ocean crashes with relentless force. The locals have told stories about the sea for centuries of lost sailors, ghost ships, and especially about La Sirena, the mermaid of the Peruvian shores. Unlike the beautiful, whimsical mermaids in fairy tales, La Sirena in our legends isn't a gentle, dreamy creature. She's a dangerous entity, a predator, a hungry soul seeking the life force of unfortunate people who venture into her domain. Of course, at 14, I thought I knew everything and didn't believe in these superstitious stories. The world was mine to explore, and no ancient tale was going to prevent me from discovering it. That summer, my father had rented a house near the beach, giving our family a 2-week vacation. My younger brother Diego and I eagerly explored the cliffs and caves, climbed the massive rocks jutting out into the sea, and swam in the small coves protected by high, rocky walls. On a particularly hot afternoon, while playing on the beach, we met 2 girls, our age, Isabel and Carolina. They were from Lima, Peru's capital, and were also on vacation with their families. Isabel had long black hair and a radiant smile, while Carolina was shorter with darker skin and mischievous eyes that were constantly searching for adventure. We quickly became friends, and over the next few days, the 4 of us became tireless explorers of the Molendo coastline. We discovered caves, chased crabs across the rocks, and found colorful seashells. One afternoon, as we sat on the rocks overlooking the sea, Carolina proposed a bold idea. "Have you heard of the Cueva Oscura?" Carolina asked, lowering her voice dramatically. "They say it's the most dangerous and mysterious cave in Molendo. It can only be accessed during low tide." Isabel shook her head nervously. "My parents warned me never to go there. The locals say it's where La Sirena lives." "La Sirena?" Diego asked, his eyes widening with curiosity. He was only 12 and still easily impressed by such stories. "The mermaid," Carolina explained with a theatrical whisper, "but not like Ariel from the movie. This one lures people with her beautiful singing, then drags them underwater and devours their souls." I scoffed, trying to appear brave in front of the girls. "That's just a story to keep children from swimming in dangerous places." "Maybe," Carolina replied with a challenging smile. "But are you brave enough to find out for sure?" Isabel looked uncomfortable. "My grandmother says La Sirena is real." She told me that 30 years ago, 3 fishermen disappeared near that cave. Their boat was found empty, floating near the shore the next morning. "People drown all the time," I reasoned. "The currents are strong here." "Then you wouldn't mind exploring the cave tonight?" Carolina pressed her eyes, gleaming with excitement. "During the full moon, when the tide is lowest," Diego tugged at my sleeve. "Miguel, I don't think—" "I'm in," I interrupted, not wanting to appear cowardly. "We'll go tonight after our parents are asleep." Isabel hesitated, but eventually nodded. "I'll come too, but only to make sure you all stay safe." And so our fate was sealed with the reckless courage of youth. That evening I pretended to go to bed early, telling my parents I was tired from swimming all day. Diego was unusually quiet during dinner, and I could tell he was nervous about our planned adventure. Around 11 o'clock, when the house was silent and our parents were asleep, we slipped out through our bedroom window. The night was unusually warm, with a full moon hanging low over the ocean, casting a silvery path across the water. The tide was indeed at its lowest point, revealing stretches of beach normally hidden beneath the waves. We met the girls at our agreed spot, a large rock formation that local fishermen called El Vigilante, because it resembled a watchful guardian facing the sea. Carolina had brought a backpack with flashlights, water, and snacks. Isabel looked pale in the moonlight, clearly having second thoughts, but too proud to back out. "It's about a 20-minute walk along the shore," Carolina explained. "We'll have to climb over some rocks to reach it." The journey was more challenging than we expected. The beach was lined with sharp, slippery rocks that were treacherous even in the bright moonlight. The sound of waves crashing against the cliffs created an ominous backdrop to our adventure. Several times Diego nearly lost his footing on the wet stones, and I had to steady him. "Maybe we should turn back," Isabel suggested after a particularly difficult scramble over a jagged formation. "The tide will start coming in soon." "We're almost there," Carolina insisted, pointing ahead to a dark opening at the base of a towering cliff. "That's Cueva Oscura." The cave entrance was partially obscured by large rocks, creating a narrow passage that would be completely submerged during high tide. We had to crawl on our hands and knees to enter the rough stones, scraping our palms and knees. The salty smell of the sea was overwhelming inside, mixed with something else, something musty and ancient. Once past the entrance, the cave opened up into a larger chamber, tall enough for us to stand. Our flashlight beams danced across wet stone walls covered in strange patterns, some natural formations, others looked disturbingly like ancient carvings, worn smooth by centuries of tidal flows. "This is incredible," I whispered, my voice echoing slightly in the enclosed space. Despite my earlier bravado, I felt a growing unease. The cave seemed to swallow our flashlight beams, the darkness deeper than it should have been. "Look how far it goes back," Carolina said, pointing her light toward the rear of the chamber where a narrow tunnel led deeper into the cliff. "Should we explore further?" "I don't think that's a good idea," Isabel said firmly. "We've seen the cave. Let's head back before the tide turns." As if to emphasize her point, we heard the crash of a larger wave outside the sound, echoing ominously through the cave. "Just a little farther," Carolina insisted. "We might not get another chance." Before anyone could object further, she headed toward the tunnel, her flashlight beam bouncing ahead of her. Reluctantly, we followed, not wanting to split up in this eerie place. The tunnel stretched about 30 meters into the cliff before opening into another chamber. This one was smaller than the first, but had a feature that made us all freeze in wonder: a pool of still dark water in the center, perfectly circular, as if artificially created. The surface was so smooth it reflected the beam of our flashlights like a black mirror. "It must connect to the ocean underwater," I said, approaching the edge cautiously, "like a natural well." Diego knelt beside me, reaching out to touch the water. "Don't!" Isabel grabbed his wrist. "Remember the stories." We fell silent, standing around the mysterious pool. The only sound was the distant crash of waves at the cave entrance and the occasional drip of water from the ceiling. Then we heard a faint humming sound, almost like a melody coming from somewhere beyond the pool. "Do you hear that?" Carolina whispered, her earlier confidence now tinged with uncertainty. We all nodded, straining to listen. The humming grew slightly louder, more distinct, a haunting melody that seemed both beautiful and profoundly sad. It was unlike any music I'd ever heard, with notes that seemed to resonate directly inside my chest rather than entering through my ears. "It's just the wind through the caves," I said, though I didn't believe it myself. The sound was too deliberate, too structured to be random. "It's her," Isabel whispered, backing away from the pool. "It's La Sirena." "Don't be ridiculous," Carolina said, but her voice trembled slightly. "There's probably another chamber beyond this one where the sound is coming from. Let's check it out." "No," Isabel said firmly. "We need to leave. Now." As if in response to her words, the humming abruptly stopped. The silence that followed felt heavy, oppressive. Then the surface of the pool, previously mirror-smooth, began to ripple slightly small concentric circles, expanding outward as if something was rising from below. "Something's in the water," Diego gasped, backing away. Before any of us could respond, we heard a loud splash from the tunnel behind us, the sound of a large wave breaking against the rocks near the entrance. "The tide's coming in," I realized with sudden horror. "We need to get out before the entrance is submerged." We turned to leave, our flashlight beams bouncing wildly as we scrambled back through the tunnel. When we reached the first chamber, we saw water already beginning to seep in through the narrow entrance passage. "Hurry!" I urged, dropping to my knees to crawl through the opening. The others followed, panic giving us speed. We emerged onto the beach just as another large wave crashed against the rocks, sending spray high into the air. The moon was now higher in the sky, and the water level had risen noticeably. "We made it just in time," Carolina said, breathless with relief. But as we turned to begin our journey back along the shore, Isabel grabbed my arm, her fingers digging painfully into my flesh. "Listen," she whispered. Behind us, from within the cave, the humming had resumed, louder now, more insistent. But it wasn't coming from deep inside the cave anymore. It seemed to be following us out. "Run," Diego whispered, his face pale in the moonlight. We didn't need to be told twice. We scrambled across the rocks, slipping and sliding in our haste. The journey back seemed twice as long and 3 times as dangerous, with waves now breaking higher on the shore, limiting our path. Several times we had to wade through ankle-deep water, the cold Pacific threatening to knock us off our feet. All the while, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us from the sea, following our progress, waiting for one of us to fall. We finally reached El Vigilante, our starting point, and collapsed on the sand, breathing hard. The beach here was wider, safer from the encroaching tide. "Did you see anything?" Isabel asked, her voice barely audible over the sound of the waves. "In the pool, did you see it?" We all shook our heads, but I knew we had all felt it, a presence in that dark water, something ancient and hungry, disturbed from its slumber by our intrusion. "Let's never speak of this again," Carolina suggested, her earlier adventurous spirit completely gone. "Let's pretend we never went there." We all agreed, making a pact of silence that night beneath the full moon. We returned to our homes, slipping back through windows and into beds, carrying our secret like a heavy stone. The next day I woke with a strange rash on my arms, red itchy welts that seemed to pulse with their own rhythm. Diego had them too, though not as severe. When our mother noticed, we blamed it on a bad reaction to sunscreen. She seemed skeptical, but didn't press the issue. When we met the girls at the beach that afternoon, I noticed Isabel had similar marks on her neck and wrists. Only Carolina seemed unaffected. We avoided talking about the previous night, instead playing volleyball and swimming in the safe, shallow waters near the crowded public beach. But as the day progressed, I began to feel increasingly unwell. A persistent headache throbbed behind my eyes, and no amount of water seemed to quench my unusual thirst. By evening I was running a fever, and my mother confined me to bed, worried I had caught some sort of virus. From my bedroom window I could see the ocean, the waves glittering in the moonlight. As I drifted in and out of feverish sleep, I could have sworn I heard that same haunting melody floating on the night breeze, calling me, beckoning me back to the water. The next morning we learned that Carolina had disappeared during the night. Her parents were frantic, telling the police she must have sleepwalked out of their rented house. Search parties combed the beaches and nearby areas but found nothing except a single sandal on the rocks near Cueva Oscura. Isabel came to visit me that afternoon, her face drawn with fear and guilt. "She went back," she whispered, sitting at the edge of my bed. "She told me she couldn't stop thinking about the cave, about the music. She said she needed to see what was in the water." I stared at her in horror. "You should have stopped her." "I tried," Isabel insisted, tears forming in her eyes. "I told her about the stories my grandmother shared, that once La Sirena marks you, she doesn't give up. That's what these rashes are, Miguel." "They're her mark. She's calling us." I wanted to dismiss her words as superstition, but the persistent melody in my dreams and the strange, unnatural quality of my fever made it impossible to deny that something unnatural had happened in that cave. "What do we do?" I asked, fear gripping my heart. "My grandmother said there's a way to break her hold," Isabel explained. "A curandero, a healer who knows the old ways. She's sending one to see us tonight." The curandero arrived after dark, an elderly man with weathered skin and eyes that seemed to hold centuries of wisdom. He examined our rashes, listening gravely as Isabel explained our experience in the cave, omitting nothing. "You were fortunate," he said finally. "3 of you are marked, but lightly. Your friend who returned to the cave, her mark must have been deeper." "Can you help us?" Diego asked, his voice small and frightened. The old man nodded slowly. "La Sirena is an ancient spirit from before the Spanish came. She feeds on life force, drawing people to the water where she can consume their essence. Those who are only lightly marked can be freed from her call." He performed a cleansing ritual using herbs prayers and a reddish paste that stung when applied to our rashes. The process took hours, and by the end I felt strangely lighter, as if a weight had been lifted from my chest. The melody that had haunted my dreams faded to a distant memory. "You must never go near that cave again," the curandero warned as he prepared to leave. "And for 3 generations your family should avoid the sea during full moons. La Sirena has a long memory and does not forgive those who escape her." Carolina's body washed ashore 3 days later, found by fishermen near the rocks outside Cueva Oscura. The official cause of death was drowning, but those who saw her body spoke in whispers about the strange, peaceful smile on her face and her eyes described as empty, as if something had been drawn out of them. We left Molendo the next day, our vacation cut short by the tragedy. In the years that followed, I honored the curandero's warning, avoiding the ocean during full moons and eventually moving inland to Lima for university. Diego did the same, becoming a doctor in Cusco, far from any coastline. Only Isabel remained connected to the sea, becoming a marine biologist. We kept in touch over the years, sharing the bond of survivors. She told me once that in her studies of marine ecosystems, she occasionally encountered phenomena that science couldn't explain. Sounds recorded in the deep ocean that matched the melody we heard, or patterns of bioluminescence that formed symbols similar to the carvings we saw in the cave. "The ocean has secrets we're not meant to understand," she wrote in her last email to me. "Ancient things that existed long before us and will remain long after we're gone." 20 years later, I finally returned to Molendo for my father's funeral. Standing on the beach at sunset, watching the waves crash against the distant cliffs, I felt a familiar pull, not the compulsion of La Sirena's call, but the natural human fascination with the unknown. I walked along the shore until I could see the distant outline of El Vigilante. Beyond it lay Cueva Oscura, now officially off limits due to several drownings over the years. As darkness fell and the moon rose, a waning crescent safely past full, I thought I heard just for a moment the faintest trace of that haunting melody carried on the wind. Some say La Sirena only hunts during the full moon, when the boundary between worlds thins. Others claim she can emerge whenever she senses vulnerability or desire the longing for something beyond ordinary experience. The curandero told us she was ancient, from a time when the division between human and non-human was less distinct, when entities could move freely between realms. I've never returned to Cueva Oscura, and I never will. But sometimes on nights when the moon is bright and the air carries the scent of salt water, I dream of dark, still pools and haunting music. I wake with the taste of the ocean on my lips and the fading sensation of cool water closing over my head. And in those moments I understand why Carolina went back, why some people walk willingly into the sea, never to return. Because for all its danger, there's something seductive about touching the unknown, about connecting, however briefly, with forces that existed long before humanity and will remain long after we're gone. If you ever find yourself on the beaches of Peru during a full moon and hear a melody unlike any human music, walk quickly in the opposite direction. Cover your ears, fix your gaze inland, and remind yourself that some mysteries are best left unexplored. For once La Sirena marks you as hers, only the strongest protection can break her claim. And not everyone is as lucky as I was.